Lost sweetheart. Senior Chief Ryan Calder's voice cut across the hangar like a blade, and 24 of the most decorated Navy SEALs in the Pacific Fleet turned in unison toward the blonde woman standing calmly beside their mission map. She didn't flinch. She didn't look up. She placed one red marker on a narrow mountain pass and said quietly that their planned route would be gone in 90 minutes. If you believe that real authority is earned, not given, subscribe to this channel. Follow this story until the very last word and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The marker landed on the map with a sound that nobody in the hangar should have noticed, a soft, dry click against laminated paper, and yet every man in the room heard it. Maybe because no one had expected her hand to be that steady. Maybe because no one had expected her to be there at all. Lieutenant Commander Audrey Mercer had been standing beside the mission briefing table for 4 minutes before Senior Chief Ryan Calder made his entrance. She had not announced herself. She had not asked for attention. She had simply pulled her cold weather field pack off her shoulder, set it beside the equipment rack with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this 100 times in worse conditions than a heated hangar, and begun studying the topographic overlay spread across the center table. She was 34 years old, 5'7", with blonde hair pulled into a high ponytail, so tight it looked like it could survive a Category 4 Arctic gale, which, given where they were going, was not an exaggeration. She wore standard-issue cold weather gear, no rank pin displayed on the outer layer, no unit patch on her arm. In a room full of men who communicated their status through the medals on their dress uniforms and the stories on their faces, she looked to the untrained eye like someone who had wandered in from the administrative building. Ryan Calder had been reading people for 20 years. He was 41, built like the result of a manufacturing process that had been optimized specifically for hostility, and he carried the particular authority of a man who had bled for his credibility in places that would never appear on an unclassified map. He had buried 3 teammates. He had stood on foreign soil at 3 in the morning and made decisions that no training manual would ever be able to fully prepare a human being to make. He had earned every inch of deference the men in this room showed him, and he wore that knowledge the way he wore his gear, close to the skin, always present, never decorative. He took one look at the woman beside the mission map, made his assessment in less than 2 seconds, and opened his mouth. Lost sweetheart. The laughter that followed was not loud. It was the controlled sideways kind, the kind that stays just under the surface, so it cannot be officially reported. Shoulders shifted. Eyes moved. A few of the younger operators let small smiles cross their faces before they remembered to put them away. Audrey Mercer did not look up from the map. She moved the red marker 2 centimeters north of where she'd first placed it, recalibrated something in her mind, and said without any change in tone, "The northern approach corridor has a crosswind problem that your mission plan doesn't account for. At current progression, that pass will be impassable in 90 minutes, possibly less." Calder walked toward her. His boots were loud on the concrete floor, deliberately so. He stopped on the opposite side of the table, crossed his arms, and looked down at the map with the expression of a man who was making a point about geography without saying anything about geography. Experienced operators don't take field guidance from someone who came in without a unit ID reading weather printouts. "I'm not reading weather printouts," Audrey said. She finally looked up. Her eyes were a particular shade of gray-green that in the harsh overhead lighting of the hangar looked like the surface of a frozen lake, clear all the way down, but not inviting. "I'm reading the terrain. The printouts are in my head." One of the SEALs, near the back of the group. Petty Officer Lucas Grant, 27. The team's communications specialist, with the kind of face that was still young enough to show everything. He was thinking, shifted his weight, and glanced between Calder and the woman with an expression that looked like he was watching a fuse burn. Calder placed both hands on the table and leaned forward slightly. "And you are the person who designed the communication architecture for the station you're trying to reach," Audrey said. "And the person who mapped every emergency access route in that installation, including 3 that don't appear on your mission overlay because they're classified above the briefing level this operation was initially assigned." She paused. "So we should probably fix your map before the general gets here." The silence that followed had a different quality than the silence before. It was not amusement anymore. It was the sound of 24 men recalibrating. The hangar doors opened. Lieutenant General Adrian Wolfe walked in from the cold, with the particular economy of movement that very senior officers develop. Not rushed, not slow, simply efficient in a way that made everything around him seem slightly more purposeful by proximity. He was 58, silver-haired, with a jaw like the prow of an icebreaker, and eyes that had seen enough of the world to stop being surprised by most of it. He did not look at the seals first. He looked at the map. Then he looked at the woman standing beside it. Calder straightened immediately. "Sir, we're ready for the mission, Commander." General Wolfe looked at Calder. Then he looked back at Audrey. "You're already speaking to her," he said. "Lieutenant Commander Mercer is in command of this operation." Nobody moved. Lucas Grant's mouth opened approximately 3 millimeters before he remembered to close it. Calder's expression did not shatter. It was more precise than that it cracked along a single line like a windshield that's been hit at exactly the wrong angle. His jaw tightened. His eyes cut to Wolfe, then to Audrey, then back to Wolfe, running the math on whether what he had just heard was actually what he had heard. "Sir," he started. "The briefing begins now," Wolfe said without raising his voice by a single decibel. "Commander Mercer." Audrey did not permit herself even 1 second of visible satisfaction. She understood, had understood for 7 years, that the moment a woman takes any pleasure in proving a room wrong, that pleasure becomes the story. And she had not come here for a story. She had come here for 6 missing people, and 1 encryption module, and a storm that was going to close the mountain pass, whether any of them were ready or not. 6 personnel are unaccounted for at Northern Lantern Station, she said, and her voice shifted into a register that was direct and clean. The voice of someone who had given briefings in conditions where every extra word was a second of warmth wasted. Including Naval Intelligence Officer Hannah Price, who was 12 hours into an investigation of coordinated penetration attempts against the Arctic Defense Network when the station went silent. She moved her marker across the map. The official route is compromised. A recent ice shift within the last 36 hours, based on satellite imaging, and the station's last automated environmental report, has destabilized the primary corridor at this point. She tapped the map. Anyone following your original mission plan walks into a dead end at altitude in deteriorating conditions. What's the alternative? Asked a SEAL named Okafor, a chief petty officer broad-shouldered with the measured calm of a man who understood that the most useful thing he could do in most situations was listen first. Secondary access. Narrower, lower elevation for the first mile, but it keeps you out of the primary wind corridor and puts you at the station's east maintenance entry inside 40 minutes from landing. Audrey looked at Calder. "Which entry does your team know?" Calder's voice was controlled, but it had that flat quality that anger takes when it's being managed very carefully. "North." "Then your team knows the wrong entry for tonight." Another moment of recalibration moved through the room. General Wolfe did not intervene. He watched Audrey the way a man watches something he built being tested for the first time in actual conditions, with attention, without interference. Calder stepped back from the table, not retreating positioning. He looked at Wolfe. "General, with respect, my team has operated in Arctic environments. We've run extractions in worse conditions than this. A ground commander should lead the physical operation, and the intelligence officer should be aboard the command aircraft," Audrey said, completing his sentence. "Yes, I know what you're about to propose." Calder looked at her. "It's standard operational logic. It's also the reason the official mission map doesn't include 3 classified access routes," Audrey said. "This station has compartmentalized emergency architecture that was built specifically so that no one person except its designer would have the complete picture in an emergency. That's a security feature. Tonight in this situation, it means the person who has to be on the ground is me." She held his gaze. "I don't love that either, but it's true." Wolfe stepped forward and added quietly, but with the particular weight of finality that very senior generals carry in their quieter moments. "Commander Mercer was the lead architect on this installation's emergency systems. She is also the only officer with full access to the classified route network. The State Department and the Joint Chiefs approved her field deployment specifically because of that. This is not an administrative decision. It is an operational necessity. Calder was quiet for 3 seconds. In that silence, Lucas Grant watched him the way you watch a structure under load, waiting to see where the stress would show. Then Calder said, "If she makes a call in the field that endangers my team, I will override it." Audrey answered before Wolfe could. "If I make a call that is genuinely wrong and endangers your team, I expect you to." She pulled her pack onto her shoulders. "But I'd ask you to figure out first whether a call is wrong or just unfamiliar." Calder stared at her for a long moment. Then he turned to his team. "Gear up, we're moving in 20. He did not say he accepted her command. He did not have to. In the way that mattered, in the way that is not about words, he had just made his position clear. He would go. He would watch. And the moment she gave him a reason he could justify in his own conscience, he would step in. Audrey knew it. She pulled on her outer layer and did not waste a single second worrying about it. She had operated under those conditions before. The only way through was through. The helicopters launched into a sky the color of old pewter. The kind of sky that didn't threaten so much as simply declare that it had already decided what it was going to do and was simply waiting for everyone below to catch up. 2 aircraft running tight formation, the noise of the rotors absorbed by the weight of the cloud ceiling pressing down from 8,000 feet. Audrey sat across from Calder in the second helicopter, a mission map folded across her knees, a set of environmental readouts feeding onto the small tablet secured to her left forearm. Lucas Grant sat beside her, his communications array set up across his lap, with the particular intense focus of a young man who knows he is operating beside people who will notice every mistake. For the first 15 minutes of the flight, Calder didn't say anything to her. He talked to his operators short clean exchanges equipment, confirmations position updates, with the practiced rhythm of a man whose team communicated the way a well-maintained engine runs smooth, reliable without waste. Then he looked at her. "What's your cold weather field qualification?" he asked. It was not a respectful question. It was a probe, the kind of question that is designed not to seek information, but to locate weakness, to find the soft place in the wall. "Arctic Seer," Audrey said. "Level 3. Polar Survival Qualification through the Norwegian Joint Warfare Center. 2 winters at McMurdo. 1 extraction exercise in the Brooks Range that went about 30% sideways and taught me more than the previous 4 years of certification combined." She didn't look up from her tablet. "You..." He hadn't expected her to turn it back around. His eyes narrowed very slightly. 18 months combined Arctic deployment time. "Then you have more cold weather field hours than I do," she said. "Which is why I need you on the ground and not back at Kodiak." She finally looked up. "I'm not trying to compete with you, Senior Chief. I'm trying to use what we both have." He didn't answer that. She turned back to her tablet. 2 minutes later he asked, "How familiar are you with the station's structural layout below the ground floor?" "I designed it." "Not the same as walking it." "No," she agreed. "It's not." She pulled up a schematic on the tablet and turned it toward him. "Walk me through what your team would normally do in a hostile environment underground extraction. I want to know what I might not have designed for." He looked at the schematic. He was quiet for a moment, and Lucas Grant, watching from the side, had the sense that something had shifted by 3 degrees, not a full turn, nothing you could put your finger on, but a movement. Calder took the tablet. "Your maintenance corridors are too narrow for a full team with extraction equipment to move through in a hurry." "I know. They were designed for single-person emergency access, not tactical deployment. If we need to use them, we go in pairs. No more." She pulled the tablet back. "What else?" "Your secondary power relay is exposed on the east wall. If someone wanted to kill the station's internal sensors without triggering the main alarm, that's where they'd go." Audrey's expression changed, not dramatically, but in the precise way that a very controlled person's expression changes when something connects that they hadn't quite connected before. "That's not in the security analysis." "No," Calder said. "It's in what I notice when I look at a building." She made a note on the tablet. "Then you're already making this mission better." He looked at her. She wasn't performing gratitude. She wasn't using the tone of someone who was managing him. She meant it plainly and without decoration. He looked away again out the window at the cloud cover. But the angle of his jaw had changed by 1 degree. Lucas Grant noticed. He didn't say anything. The first emergency signal came at 20 miles out. It burst across the communications array with a full military authentication code, proper format, proper encryption wrapper, complete with the station identification signature that meant it had originated from inside Northern Lantern. A voice distorted by static but recognizably stressed was reporting equipment failure and requesting immediate diversion to a landing zone at a frozen lake 8 miles northwest of the station. "That's a valid auth code," Lucas said, immediately pulling up his verification panel. "Military-grade encryption correct format structure. I'm not seeing any anomalies in the transmission envelope." Calder's hand was already on his headset. "Commander, we have a priority diversion request from inside the station. Valid authentication." "Hold position," Audrey said. "Commander." "Both aircraft hold current position." She set her voice absolutely flat. "Do not alter course." Calder's expression tightened. "We have a valid authentication code from inside the installation we're trying to reach, and you want us to stop." "The station call sign in that transmission was retired 6 months ago," Audrey said. She was already running something on her tablet, her fingers moving quickly. Northern Lantern switched to the Delta 7 identifier in the April communications cycle. Whoever sent that signal either accessed old protocol documentation or is using a system that hasn't been updated since before April. Lucas stared at his panel. "How do you know the call sign from a voice transmission, the distortion?" "I built the call sign system. I know what Delta 7 sounds like. That transmission used the old Sierra 3 identifier." Audrey looked at Calder. "Someone with access to pre-April documentation is directing us toward that lake. I want to know why before I put 2 aircraft down on it." The silence in the helicopter lasted approximately 4 seconds. Then from the lead helicopter, Chief Okafor's voice came through the comms. "Eyes on the lake at 8 miles. Something's moving on the surface." "What kind of movement?" Audrey asked. "Heavy. Slow. Looks like—" Okafor paused. "Unmanned supply vehicle. One of the large cargo platforms. Moving toward the center of the lake." Audrey said, "How thick is the ice?" Lucas was already checking. "Based on current temperature data and last satellite pass, estimated 12 to 14 inches at the center. An unmanned supply platform loaded for a station drop could run—" He did the calculation. "Between 800 and 1,200 pounds. Which is at the upper limit of what that ice can hold," Audrey said. "Or past it." She was right. 11 seconds later, the sound reached them, even through the helicopter noise, a deep structural groan that the microphones on the aircraft's exterior sensors picked up and converted to a visible waveform on Lucas's display, and then a section of ice approximately 40 feet across collapsed under the weight of the supply platform and swallowed it completely. Nobody spoke for 3 seconds. Lucas let out a breath that was not quite a word. Calder looked at the lake. Then he looked at Audrey. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The math was visible on his face. 2 helicopters full equipment loads, 26 people landing on ice that had just demonstrated what it did to 1,200 pounds. "Whoever sent that signal," Audrey said, "has access to old protocol documentation, knows our mission parameters well enough to construct a realistic diversion, and has the operational capacity to pre-position a supply vehicle on that lake." She looked at Calder. "This is not a system failure. Someone is running an active interference operation against us." "Who?" Calder asked. His voice was quiet now, a different kind of quiet than before. "I have a theory," Audrey said, "and I need you to hear it without assuming I'm trying to protect someone." They landed on a ridge 2 miles from the station and continued on foot, the cold meeting them like a wall they had to choose to walk through. The wind at that elevation was not dramatic. It was steady and absolute, the kind of cold that doesn't announce itself with gusts, but simply sits at -24 Celsius and waits to see how long you last. Calder's team moved with the particular economy of people who have trained their bodies to do everything efficiently, because inefficiency at this temperature is a tax you can't afford. Audrey moved with them, not at the front, not at the back, positioned naturally in the formation's middle, with Lucas beside her, her pace matching theirs without visible effort. Calder noticed. He did not comment on it. "Daniel Cross," Audrey said while they moved. Calder didn't look at her. "The station's former security director." "He was my mentor," Audrey said. "He brought me into the original Northern Lantern design team when I was a lieutenant. He was one of the most operationally careful security architects I've ever worked with." She paused. 2 years ago, there was a security breach in the Arctic Defense Network. An unauthorized access event that exposed a classified communication protocol. I wrote the investigation report. "I read about it," Calder said. "Then you know Daniel Cross was identified as having access to the specific system that was compromised." "He was cleared," Calder said. "Eventually," Audrey said. "But the process took 14 months. His security clearance was suspended. His contract was terminated. By the time the review panel found he had not intentionally caused the breach, the operational community had already moved on. Nobody rehires a man who spent 14 months under security investigation regardless of the outcome." Calder glanced at her. His breath misted in the cold air. "And your report identified him." "My report identified the access point. His credentials were the ones used to reach it." Audrey kept walking. "I reported what I found. It was accurate. It was also incomplete because the full picture of how those credentials were compromised, the external manipulation that made it look like an inside job, took another 3 years to surface." She paused. "He was cleared, but his career was gone." "And now his codename is showing up at a compromised station," Calder said. "The lighthouse," Audrey said. "That's what the message scratched into the frost meant." Calder stopped walking. 3 of his operators smoothly adjusted around him, maintaining spacing without breaking stride, the reflex of years. "What message? I'll show you when we reach the station." Audrey stopped 2 facing him. In the gray-white light of the Arctic afternoon, the sun technically above the horizon, somewhere behind the cloud cover, contributing light without warmth. Her expression was entirely clear. "I need you to understand that I am not protecting him. If Cross compromised that station, I will say so. But I am also not going to assume he betrayed it simply because his name appears in the wreckage." Calder looked at her for a long moment. "And if he did betray it?" "Then I will be partly responsible," Audrey said. "Because I know him, and I know how a man who has lost everything starts calculating what he has left to trade." She held Calder's gaze. "That's the theory I need you to hear without assuming I'm choosing him over this mission." Calder started walking again. "Tell me the rest when we're inside." The station was silent in a way that active places never are when they're simply unoccupied. This was the silence of something interrupted equipment, mid-cycle work surfaces in mid-use. The precise stillness of a place where people had been, and then suddenly were not. The team entered through the east maintenance access that Audrey had recalibrated them to. The passage was exactly as narrow as Calder had said. Pairs-only equipment carried at angles, and the movement through it was controlled and careful, and took 8 minutes longer than the north entry would have. 8 minutes that on a different night might have mattered. They spread through the main level in practiced formation clearing sections, with the efficiency of people who have done this enough times that the procedure has become instinctive. Audrey stayed central, moving when the team moved, watching the structural layout against the map in her head, measuring what she found against what she had built. The signs of struggle were present but not dramatic. Overturned equipment rather than broken walls. Personal items left mid-task rather than scattered by force. It told a story of sudden, unexpected interruption, people who had been working and then stopped very quickly without time to prepare for stopping. Calder found the message. It was scratched into the frost that had accumulated on the interior of a rarely accessed panel beside the communications core, not scratched with anything high-tech, but with something narrow and metal. A deliberate score in the ice that had been there long enough to refrost slightly over the edges of the letters. "The lighthouse is watching." He called Audrey over. She read it. Her face did something careful and controlled, not hiding a reaction, but managing one the way a person does when something is confirming a fear they had been hoping would not be confirmed. "The lighthouse," she said. It was what Cross and I called the station's surveillance corps during the design phase. It wasn't an official designation. It was a working nickname, the kind of thing you develop during a long project. She looked at Calder. Nobody else would have known it. Then he's here, Calder said. He was here, Audrey said. The refrosting on those letters means it was written at least 24 hours ago. He had time to write it and leave. Or he's still here and left you a message designed to make you think he's gone, Calder said. Audrey did not dismiss this. Both possibilities are on the table. Lucas had set up his communications array on the station's main console and was running systematic frequency sweeps, his focus entirely on the panels in front of him. "I'm picking up something," he said. His voice was careful, the way young people's voices get when they're not sure if what they've found is important or a mistake. "Beneath us, subterranean level." "There's a maintenance chamber," Audrey said. "I know," Lucas said. "I'm picking up electromagnetic activity down there. Body heat signature variation consistent with..." He paused, running the numbers again. "Multiple people, possibly 5, possibly more. They're alive." Calder was already moving toward the floor access. "Where's the entry?" "Sealed from outside," Audrey said. "External locking mechanism on the maintenance level entrance. It would take the kind of force that..." She stopped. She looked at Calder. "Your team." "My team," he confirmed. The next 6 minutes were efficient. The SEALs worked the sealed entrance with practiced precision, not with explosives, not with anything that would compromise the structural integrity of a chamber that was currently protecting living people, but with a hydraulic tool that Okafor produced from his pack, with the casual assurance of a man who carries the right thing for every situation because he's been in enough situations to know. The seal gave. The access opened. The cold that came up from below was different from the station's cold, older staler, the cold of a space that had been closed for a long time. And with it came the sound of breathing, the particular careful breathing of people who have been in an enclosed space long enough to know that air is something to manage. 5 faces looked up from the maintenance chamber. 5 people, technicians, operators. 1 communications specialist, with the hollow eyes of people who had been through something and were now in the process of figuring out what to do with the fact that they had survived it. 5 people, not 6. Calder looked at Audrey. She was already counting. Her expression had gone very still. "Hannah Price," she said, "and Daniel Cross." She looked at the surviving technician nearest the access. "Where are they?" The technician, a young woman whose name tag read. Kowalski reached for the ladder and climbed up 3 rungs before her legs quite worked properly, and one of the SEALs caught her arm and supported her without being asked. "Cross came 2 days ago," Kowalski said. Her voice was steady in the way that shock sometimes makes voices steady, not calm, just temporarily simplified. "He said someone inside the network was planning to take the encryption module. He said he couldn't report it through official channels because those channels were compromised." She swallowed. "Before he could tell us who they came." "Who came?" Calder asked. "Contractors, 6 of them, armed, professional, coordinated." Kowalski looked at Audrey. "Cross took Agent Price and the module through the old research tunnel on the lower level. He said..." She stopped. "He said if the rescue team got here to tell them that the lighthouse still works, that it was watching the whole time." Calder looked at Audrey. The question on his face was not hostile. It was something more complicated. It was the beginning of a man revising his assessment. Audrey looked at the floor access and the tunnel below, and something settled in her expression that was not peace, but was something adjacent to it. The particular steadiness of a person who has been carrying a weight for years and has just found out that the weight is not what they thought it was. "He didn't betray it," she said. "You don't know that yet," Calder said. But his voice had changed. It was more careful now, less certain in its certainty. "No," Audrey agreed. "I don't." She pulled her pack tight and looked at him. "But I know the man who scratched that message into the frost understood that I was coming, and he left me exactly the information I needed to believe the right thing before I saw the evidence." She met Calder's eyes. "That's not the behavior of a traitor covering his tracks. That's the behavior of someone who has been living without anyone believing him for 2 years and who is choosing to trust me one more time." Calder looked at her. He did not agree out loud, but he also did not argue. The research tunnel, he said. How old? 15 years. Pre-digital survey era. It doesn't appear on any current mission map. Audrey pulled up the schematic on her tablet and pointed. But it appears on mine. She started moving. And this time, when Calder fell in beside her, he was not lagging by half a step. He was exactly level, walking at the same pace toward the same problem as something that, if not yet equals, had at least stopped being opponents. Lucas followed behind them, his equipment running, his eyes moving between his screens, and the woman leading them forward. He had been in operational environments before, but not like this. Not with someone like this. He filed it away, the way she moved, the way she thought, the way she took in a room full of people who didn't believe in her and found the fastest possible path to making belief irrelevant. And he understood that he was watching something he would describe to people for the rest of his life. Outside, the storm was moving faster than the weather model had predicted, and deep in the mountain, ahead of them, in a tunnel that 15 years of official records had forgotten, something was waiting that none of them fully understood yet. The research tunnel entrance was exactly where Audrey said it would be, behind a secondary utility panel on the lower maintenance level, behind a wall that the current station schematics listed as solid concrete. It was not solid concrete. It was a pressure-fitted access plate, painted to match the surrounding wall installed during the original construction, by a design team that understood the difference between the map that gets filed with the contractor and the map that keeps people alive when everything else fails. Calder ran his gloved hand along the seam and said nothing for a moment. Then, how many people know this exists? Originally 4. The lead architect, 2 structural engineers, and me. Audrey worked the release catch, not a standard mechanism, not anything that appeared on the access panel registry, and the plate shifted inward with a sound like a slow exhale. The architects retired. The engineers are at desks in Washington, and Daniel Cross, who learned it from me during the design review. She paused. So the question we need to answer is whether Cross brought someone else into that knowledge or whether he came here alone. And the contractors, Calder asked. Don't know it exists, Audrey said, or they'd have sealed it already. Okafor appeared at Calder's shoulder. He had left 2 operators with the 5 survivors and brought the rest forward. He looked at the open access and then at Audrey with the particular expression of a man who has revised his estimate of a situation and is not especially pleased about needing to. 2 by 2, Calder said. I'm on point with Commander Mercer. Okafor, you're behind us. Grant stays 3rd communications running. Lucas nodded, his equipment already, active, his face, doing the concentrated thing it did when he was trying to hold more information than was comfortable. They moved into the tunnel. The air inside was cold in a different way than the station, not the recycled cold of a climate-controlled space, but the older mineral cold of rock and compressed time, the kind of cold that exists at a depth where surface weather is a rumor. The walls were bare stone and old reinforced concrete, the floor. Uneven, the ceiling low enough that Calder had to angle his shoulders slightly. He moved through it without complaint. Audrey moved through it without difficulty. Behind them, Lucas muttered something under his breath that might have been a calculation or might have been a prayer. It was hard to tell the difference at this temperature. They had been moving for 4 minutes when Calder spoke. On the helicopter, he said, when I asked about your qualifications, you answered without getting defensive. You weren't asking about my qualifications, Audrey said without breaking stride. You were trying to find the weak point in the wall. A pause. Yes, I know. I've been in enough rooms like that one to recognize the shape of the question. She moved around a section of uneven floor with practiced balance. I don't find it offensive. I find it predictable, which is different. Predictable I can work with. Most officers in your position would have made that a confrontation, Calder said. Most officers in my position waste time on confrontations they don't need to win, Audrey said. I've got a missing intelligence officer and an encryption module that, if it gets into the wrong hands, compromises 12 years of Arctic defense infrastructure. I don't have time to fight you about whether you respect me. I just need you to follow the correct route. Calder was quiet for 2 steps. Then, that's either very calm or very practiced. Both, Audrey said simply. Lucas from behind them said, I'm getting a weak signal ahead. Could be a beacon. Very low power, the kind someone would use if they were trying to transmit without being detected from above. Calder held up a fist. Everyone stopped. Direction, Audrey asked. Forward and left, maybe 200 meters. Lucas adjusted something on his panel. It's intermittent. Not a distress signal, the pattern is too regular. More like a pulse, repeating. Audrey and Calder looked at each other in the low light. She could see him processing it, the way his eyes moved slightly when he was working through tactical options, the slight forward lean that meant he was ready to accelerate. Could be a trap, he said. Could be cross, she said. Those aren't mutually exclusive. No, she agreed. They're not. She started moving again. Which is why we go carefully, and we go now, because if it's cross and he's transmitting at that power level, he's either pinned down or running out of options. Either way, the window is shrinking. Calder fell in beside her again. 200 meters at that pace in those conditions took slightly longer than it should have, and every extra second had a weight to it, the weight of unknown things happening in the darkness ahead. Lucas tracked the signal with quiet, focused updates. Okafor moved with the controlled readiness of a man who had spent enough time in confined spaces to know exactly how much room he had to work with and had already made peace with the answer. They heard voices before they saw the light, not loud. The tunnel carried sound, strangely compressing it and then releasing it in uneven waves, but distinct. Two voices in close proximity. One of them clearly stressed, speaking in a pattern that had the rhythm of someone holding on by increments. Calder touched Audrey's arm. They stopped. The voice that was stressed was female. The voice responding to it was male and low and steady in a way that had nothing to do with calm and everything to do with enormous deliberate control. Audrey closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. She knew that voice. She opened her eyes and moved forward, and Calder moved with her, and when they came around the final bend in the tunnel and the light from 2 handheld lanterns hit them, Audrey saw Daniel Cross for the first time in 2 years. He was 46 years old, and he looked like a man who had spent 2 years carrying something very heavy and had not been able to put it down even when he slept. He was leaner than she remembered the lines of his face, deeper, his eyes still sharp, but with a quality in them now that had not been there before, a watchfulness that was not paranoia, but was the thing that paranoia leaves behind when the danger turns out to have been real. He was sitting against the tunnel wall with his back to the stone, and the encryption module on his lap, and his hands were resting on top of it, with a stillness that in a different context might have looked protective. In this context, it looked like the last thing a man holds on to when everything else is gone. Beside him, Hannah Price was on her feet. She was 31, with the particular taut alertness of an intelligence officer who has been running on adrenaline and determination for longer than was sustainable, and she turned toward the incoming light with her hand moving to her side before she registered Audrey's face and stopped. "Mercer," she said. And then, with the specific compressed relief of someone who has been waiting for a rescue they were not fully sure was coming, "It's about time." Cross did not move. His eyes went from Audrey to Calder to the operators behind them and back to Audrey, and in that movement was the entire history of 2 years, every clearance hearing, every administrative review, every morning of waking up as a man whose name had become synonymous with a failure he had not caused. "Daniel," Audrey said. "You came yourself," he said. His voice was exactly as she remembered it, steady, precise, with a particular economy that had always reminded her of someone who had learned early that words were tools and should not be wasted. "I wasn't sure you would." "I designed the tunnel," she said. "Who else was going to come?" Something moved across his face that was not quite a smile, and was not quite grief, and was somehow both at once. Calder stepped forward. "Chief Warrant Officer Cross, you have a piece of classified hardware in your possession, and you are currently off the grid in a compromised installation. I need you to account for the module." Cross looked at Calder the way a man looks at a complication he expected. "Senior Chief Calder, I know who you are. I reviewed your operational file when I was still security director here." He did not move his hands from the module. "The module is intact. It has not been accessed since I removed it from the primary server at 1900 hours 2 days ago. The access log is running on the device itself, you can verify. Why did you remove it? Calder asked. Because the alternative was letting Arcturus Defense Solutions access it, Cross said. And that was going to happen within 48 hours from the moment I arrived. Lucas had moved his communications setup against the tunnel wall and was running something quietly. He glanced up at the mention of Arcturus and then deliberately looked back down the way intelligent young people do when they want to be invisible during an important conversation so they can keep listening. Hannah Price reached into her jacket and produced a sealed evidence bag with a data drive inside it. He brought documentation, she said, handing it to Audrey. 2 weeks of surveillance records, financial transaction logs, internal communications from Arcturus executives. She looked at Calder. He's not the leak. He found the leak and couldn't report it through official channels because the official channels are the leak. Calder looked at Cross. Why couldn't you report it? Because the network administrator at this station has been on Arcturus's supplemental payroll for 8 months, Cross said. Any report filed through the station's own system goes through his queue before it reaches the Joint Command Oversight Office. I found out 3 weeks ago, when I was hired back as a civilian consultant, they brought me in to review the station's security posture, which is one of the funnier things that has happened to me in recent years. He paused. I found the back door they'd been building. I documented it. And then I realized that sending the documentation through any official channel would tell them exactly what I'd found before it reached anyone who could act on it. So you came here in person, Audrey said. So I came here in person, Cross confirmed. 2 days ahead of the scheduled Arcturus access window. I was supposed to get the module, the documentation, and Hannah out through the research tunnel before they realized what I was doing. He looked at the tunnel ceiling. They realized faster than I expected. Calder's voice had changed again. The hostile note was gone, replaced by the focused pragmatism of a man who has received new operational information and is already incorporating it. How many contractors? I counted 6 when they hit the station, Cross said. Could be more by now. They had equipment staged outside. I saw supply loads when I arrived that weren't on any official manifest. We dealt with the diversion at the lake, Calder said. Cross looked at Audrey. They used the old Sierra 3 call sign. I know, she said. I recognized it. He held her gaze for a moment. I knew you would. And there it was in those 4 words, in the particular quietness of them, the thing that Audrey had been carrying alongside her guilt for 2 years. He had known she would recognize it because he knew exactly how she thought, because he had spent 3 years working beside her and building something with her. And even after everything that had happened between his name and her report, he had built his contingency plan around trusting her mind. Calder saw the exchange. He didn't comment, but his eyes noted it with the precision of a man who notices everything and decides later what it means. We need to move, Audrey said. The storm is accelerating. The mountain pass will close. We have a window, and it is not a generous one. There's a problem with that, Hannah said, and her voice had shifted into the specific register of someone delivering information they would rather not deliver. When I was scouting the tunnel exit 20 minutes ago, I counted at least 3 contractors positioned above it. They're not at the exit itself. They're about 60 meters up the slope, covering the exit without sitting on it, Calder said immediately. So they can't be seen from air surveillance, but they can reach the exit before anyone who comes out of it. And they have something else, Hannah said. She looked at Calder, then at Audrey. I saw demolition equipment, not personal charges, structure demolition, the kind you use to bring down a slope. The tunnel went very quiet. Lucas looked up from his console. They're going to avalanche the exit, or the station itself, Cross said. Bury everything, destroy the module, eliminate the documentation, remove the evidence of the breach, and let Arcturus reconstruct the narrative from outside. He paused. A catastrophic structural failure during an Arctic storm. Very hard to investigate. Very easy to blame on weather. Calder looked at Audrey. The calculation was visible on his face. Not panic, nothing close to panic, but the specific focused intensity of a man compressing a very complex problem into the fastest possible response time. How do we get out? He said. And the way he said it, not challenging her, not testing her, but asking her the way you ask someone who knows the answer, was different from anything he had said to her since the hangar. Audrey pulled up the schematic on her tablet. There's a geothermal vent access shaft on the north side of the tunnel system. Pre-digital era used during the original construction for equipment transfer. It exits above the slope where they've staged above and behind. They won't be watching it because it's not on any current map. How do you know it's still passable? Calder asked. I don't, Audrey said. But the geothermal activity in this section of the mountain has actually increased over the past 5 years, which means the vent itself has remained clear. She looked at him. It also means it's warm enough in the shaft that we won't lose anyone to cold exposure during the transit. How long is the transit? 40 minutes, possibly 45. Calder looked at his watch, ran the math against the storm timeline. That puts us outside the edge of the extraction window. Yes, Audrey said. It does. If anything slows us down. I know, she said, which is why nothing can slow us down. They held each other's gaze for a moment, and in that moment was the entire weight of what they were both understanding, that the margin was real, and it was narrow, and it did not allow for mistakes, and that the people in this tunnel were now depending on both of them to be exactly right in exactly the ways that the other one was not. Lead the way, Calder said. Audrey turned toward the north branch of the tunnel and started moving, and the team moved with her. And Hannah incorporated into the formation without discussion. Cross carrying the module in a way that made clear he was not going to let go of it under any circumstances. Hannah matching pace with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been trained to move under pressure and was choosing to use that training now. Lucas fell in beside Cross. He was quiet for 30 seconds, which for Lucas was an unusual length of silence. Then he said, "The repeating pulse you were transmitting, the one I picked up before we found you." Cross looked at him. What about it? You were transmitting through the module. Yes. Without activating the module's classified functions. Yes. How? Lucas asked. The question was genuine, not challenge, not suspicion, but the specific curiosity of a young technical specialist who has just encountered something he doesn't know and immediately wants to understand. Cross almost smiled. It was the first movement toward something like warmth on his face since they'd found him. The module has a passive resonance function built into its casing. It was designed as a last resort location signal, doesn't access the encrypted content, doesn't compromise the classified functions, just pulses. He paused. Audrey built it in. Lucas looked ahead at Audrey, who was moving without looking back, leading them through the tunnel with the confidence of someone walking a route they have memorized in 3 dimensions. She built in a rescue beacon. She built in a rescue beacon, Cross confirmed. In the original design, in case the module ever had to be carried by someone who wasn't an authorized operator in a situation where they couldn't use standard communications. He paused. She told me about it during the design review. I filed it in the back of my mind and never expected to need it. But you remembered, Lucas said. I had 2 years to think, Cross said, and his voice was flat in a way that contained a great deal more than flatness. Lucas didn't push further. He noted it the same way he had been noting everything since the hangar, adding it to the picture he was building of this operation, and the people in it, and then he directed his attention back to his equipment, because his equipment was telling him something. Senior Chief, he said not loudly. I'm reading a signal I didn't see before. Calder didn't break stride. What kind? Remote trigger. Encrypted. It's... Lucas ran a rapid verification, his fingers moving across the panel with the speed of someone who has practiced this until it is automatic. It's a detonation control signal. Someone above us has already armed the charges. The tunnel went silent, except for the sound of boots on stone. They're not waiting for us to get out, Okafor said from behind. No, Audrey said. She had not stopped moving. They're going to bring it down on top of us, bury everyone in the tunnel. Station module documentation personnel. She looked back at Lucas. Can you locate the trigger source? Working on it, Lucas said, and the concentration in his voice had sharpened to a point. It's encrypted, but the encryption pattern is commercial grade, not military, which means... It means you can crack it, Audrey said. It means I can try, Lucas said. And I'd feel a lot better about my chances if I could get to a better elevation. The signal is attenuating through the rock. Vent shaft, Audrey said. We go up, you work the signal. What if it's triggered before he gets it cracked? Calder asked. Audrey looked at him. Her face was absolutely steady. Then we run faster than the rock. Calder held her gaze for 1 second. Then he looked back at his team. Double time. Everyone moves. They moved. The pace in the tunnel became something that was not quite a run. The ceiling was too low, the floor too uneven, but it had the urgency of one, the team compressing all their discipline and physical conditioning into a sustained controlled push through rock and cold, and the particular narrowness of a passage that had not been built for 26 people moving fast with full gear. Lucas ran beside Audrey, now his panel active. His attention split between the floor in front of him and the data on his screen. He was doing something with the signal pattern that Audrey could not fully follow, not because she didn't understand communication systems, but because what Lucas was doing was the kind of intuitive technical improvisation that lives at the intersection of training and gift, the place where expertise becomes art. She could see from his face that it was not going easily. Talk to me, she said. The encryption is layered, he said, breathing harder than before, but keeping his voice controlled. Commercial on top, but there's a secondary layer underneath that's not commercial. It's adapted from a military protocol. Old version 2019 standard. If I can isolate the secondary layer, I can. He stopped. Ran something. There it is. You have it. I have the structure. I don't have the key. He looked at her. I need 3 minutes, and I need not to be moving through a tunnel. 60 more seconds, she said. We're almost at the vent. The vent shaft entrance was where she said it would be a vertical access cut into the tunnel ceiling, fitted with the original construction ladder, still sound, despite 15 years of disuse. Audrey tested the lowest rung with her weight before she trusted it to anyone else, felt it hold, and looked at Calder. Cross and Hannah first, she said. Then the survivors. Your operators last. Calder nodded. He was already directing the movement, his team flowing into position with the quiet efficiency of water, finding its level. No wasted motion, no confusion. Each person knowing their role, because he had spent years building a team where that knowledge was so deeply embedded it had become reflex. Cross took the module onto his back and went up the ladder with the careful speed of a man who knows exactly what he's carrying. Hannah followed. The survivors moved with the help of the SEALs, who supported without condescending each operator, matching their pace to the person they were assisting with the particular sensitivity that real experience with human limitation produces. Lucas found a position at the base of the shaft, where the signal was marginally clearer, not much, but enough, and set his panel on the most stable surface available, which was a flat section of tunnel floor that was approximately 4 inches wide and worked. Audrey watched him from one step up the ladder. She did not rush him. She did not crowd him. She gave him exactly the silence he needed and exactly the proximity that said, someone is here, someone is with you. Calder appeared beside her. He watched Lucas too. He's good, Calder said quietly. Yes, Audrey said. You knew he would be. I read his file before the mission, Audrey said. He has the highest technical assessment score in his rating for the last 3 years. He problem solves under pressure better than anyone in his peer group. She paused. He has also never run an Arctic operation, which is why everyone has been treating him like a liability. He is not a liability. Calder was quiet for a moment. You read all our files. I read all your files, she confirmed. I know every person on this team. I know what each of them is good at, and where each of them has gaps. I also know. She stopped, looked at Calder directly. I know the file on you. He met her eyes. And I know that the reason you pushed back on me in the hangar wasn't laziness or malice, she said. It was the Brennan mission. Your man died while you waited for approval. And you decided afterward that hesitation is the enemy. His jaw tightened. The name Brennan did something to his face that nothing else in the last 3 hours had done. It made him briefly entirely human. Don't, he said. I'm not using it against you, Audrey said. I'm telling you I understand it, because I have my own version. She held his gaze. 7 years ago, I identified an approaching storm during a polar rescue. I had the data, I had the read, and a senior commander overruled me and sent the team forward because we were behind schedule. She paused. 4 people died. Calder went very still. One of them was my fiancé, Audrey said. Her voice did not crack. It had not cracked in 7 years, not because she was hard, but because she had made a decision at some point. The kind of decision that comes after grief does its worst work. That the best thing she could do for the people she had lost was to be better, and being better required being functional, and being functional required keeping her voice steady when it mattered. His name was James. I was a rescue swimmer. He was 31 years old, and he was the kind of person who made every room he was in larger than it was before he walked into it. She paused. The tunnel was quiet, except for the sound of Lucas working and the soft movements of the team above them in the shaft. So I understand what it is to carry a mistake that wasn't entirely yours, she said. And I understand what it does to the way you make decisions after. You decided that speed is survival. I decided that caution is survival. And we've both been right enough times that we believe ourselves completely. She looked at him. Tonight we have to be both at once. Calder stared at her. And in his face, in the particular way that a very controlled man's face changes when something has reached the place under the control. She could see that the wall had not come down, because walls like his do not come down in one conversation, in one moment, in one tunnel, in the dark. But something had opened. A door maybe, or a window. Something that let light through. Got it, Lucas said. Both of them looked at him. I was staring at his panel with the expression of someone who has just caught something they weren't entirely sure they were going to catch. I have the trigger signal. I can block it. He looked up. But if I block it from here, they're going to know the signal is being jammed. They might switch to manual detonation. How far is the trigger source from the charges? Audrey asked. Based on the signal pattern, approximately 80 meters. Upslope. Calder looked at Audrey. The calculation happened fast. If someone goes up there and takes the trigger source, they won't have time to reach the charges manually, Audrey said. Not if we're already moving. And whoever goes up there is going directly toward the contractor's position, Calder said. Yes, Audrey said. He looked at the shaft, at his team moving upward, at Cross and the module already higher, at the tunnel around them and the weight of the mountain above it, and the storm pressing down from every direction on every plan they were trying to hold together. Then he looked at Lucas. Can you track my position from here? Yes, Lucas said. Can you jam the signal long enough to give me 80 meters? Lucas ran it. 30 seconds, maybe 40. Calder looked at Audrey. I go up and to the right of the exit. You get everyone to the extraction point. Grant jams on my mark. Audrey looked at him. She did not try to take the plan apart. She could see it was sound. She could also see that it required him to put himself directly between the contractors and the rest of the team in a storm on a slope with a 30 to 40 second window that had no margin in it at all. Okafor goes with you, she said. Okafor leads the extraction team. Okafor goes with you, she repeated. Non-negotiable. He stared at her. And then, because he was underneath everything, a man who understood the difference between stubbornness and stupidity, he said, Okafor. Okafor materialized at his shoulder with the particular readiness of a man who had been listening to every word and was already prepared. You heard, Calder said. Every word, Okafor confirmed. Let's go. They started up the ladder, and Lucas watched them go with the expression of someone who is about to do something very important and is aware of exactly how important it is. And Audrey watched all of it from the bottom of the shaft and understood that the mission had just entered its most dangerous 60 seconds and that the only thing she could do was trust every person in it. She started climbing. Above her, the vent shaft opened toward a sky that was the color of iron and moving fast, and the storm that had been coming for hours was finally fully here. The vent shaft opened onto the side of the mountain like a held breath finally released, and the storm hit them all at once. Not as wind, but as a physical fact. The kind of cold that doesn't negotiate, that simply arrives and begins its work regardless of what you planned. Audrey came through the shaft opening last, pulled herself up onto the rock surface, and immediately took account. Cross. Hannah. 5 survivors, 8 operators. Lucas already repositioning his equipment with the focused urgency of someone who knows exactly how many seconds he has and is not going to waste a single one of them. Calder and Okafor were gone. Already upslope, already moving through the gray-white blur of the storm toward a position that nobody except Calder thought he could reach in time. Audrey did not let herself think about the odds on that. She filed it in the part of her mind that she had learned over years and necessity to seal off during active operations, the part that contained all the things she couldn't control and therefore could not afford to spend energy on. "Lucas," she said. "Status. Signal is still active. They haven't tried to trigger yet." He looked up from his panel, and she could see in his face the specific combination of concentration and barely managed fear that she recognized as a young person doing the most important thing they have ever done while being completely aware that it is the most important thing they have ever done. "I'm ready to jam on Calder's mark. But Commander, I need you to understand the moment I activate the block, the signal goes dark on their end. They'll know within seconds." "I know," Audrey said. "If Calder isn't close enough to the trigger source." "I know," she said again. And then, because he needed more than acknowledgement, because he was 27 years old, and he was about to make a call that had no margin in it, and he deserved to hear this before he made it. "You're not responsible for what happens to Calder. You're responsible for buying him the time you said you could buy him. 30 seconds. 40. That's your job. Everything else is his." Lucas looked at her. He nodded once. Not the nod of someone who has been reassured, but the nod of someone who has been told the truth and has decided to hold on to it. Hannah Price appeared at Audrey's shoulder. She had the data drive from Cross's documentation in her jacket, and the particular alert stillness of an intelligence officer who has been in motion for 48 hours and is running on something past adrenaline on purpose maybe, or simply on the refusal to stop. "How are we getting everyone off this mountain?" "There's a weather shelter 400 meters northeast," Audrey said. "Pre-digital survey era, last maintained 8 years ago, but structurally sound. I verified the satellite imaging last week as part of mission prep." She was already moving, already directing the team's formation with small gestures that Cross and Hannah absorbed and followed without needing explanation, while the SEALs organized around the survivors with the practiced efficiency of a unit that has done this before. "We get to the shelter, we consolidate, we wait for Calder and Okafor, and we reassess extraction. The mountain pass." One of the survivors said Kowalski, who had been holding herself together with a rigidity that was impressive and slightly frightening. The rigidity of someone who will function perfectly until the moment it is safe to stop and not a second before. "Is it still open?" Audrey checked her tablet without breaking stride. The environmental readout was not good. It had not been good for the last 40 minutes, and it was getting less good at a rate that was consistent with the worst of her 3 projected scenarios. She had built 3 models before the mission. Best case, likely case, worst case, with the particular discipline of someone who has learned that hope is not a planning tool. "For another 22 minutes, she said. "Possibly less." Kowalski processed that. "And the extraction aircraft cannot reach us until the pass reopens. Which means we are on this mountain for the duration of the storm," Audrey said. "Which is why we are going to the shelter and not standing here discussing the shelter." She looked at Kowalski directly. "You've been in a sealed maintenance chamber for 36 hours. You're moving on reserves. So am I. So is everyone here. The way through that is forward. Just forward." Kowalski straightened by approximately 1 centimeter. It was enough. They moved. The 400 meters to the shelter in those conditions was not 400 meters in any meaningful human sense. It was a sustained physical negotiation with wind and cold, and a surface that offered exactly as much grip as it felt like offering at any given moment, which was frequently not enough. The survivors moved with the help of the operators, not carried, not dragged, but supported in the way that competent people support each other, when the conditions are at the edge of what is manageable, which is to say, with contact and presence, and the wordless communication of bodies moving through difficulty together. Cross moved beside Audrey. He hadn't spoken since the shaft. She could feel him measuring something, not the distance, not the terrain, something internal, something that had been building since the moment their eyes met in the tunnel. He said, "You read the secondary clearance report." It was not a question. "Yes," she said. "All of it. The supplemental findings. Every page." She kept moving. 14 months after my initial report, the review panel identified that your credentials had been externally harvested. Sophisticated intrusion, pre-positioned access designed specifically to implicate an insider. She paused. The supplemental findings were classified at a level most people in the relevant oversight offices never accessed. The summary they received said you were cleared. It didn't explain why or how or what it meant about the original investigation. "Your report," Cross said. His voice was not accusatory. It was something more precise than accusation. It was analytical. The voice of a man who has had 2 years to dissect a sequence of events and has reached a point where he understands every step too well to be simply angry about any of them. "Your report was accurate." "It was accurate and it was incomplete," Audrey said. "I reported what the evidence showed. I didn't—" She stopped. The words required more care than she usually gave words, because the words were about a failure that she had spent 2 years building into a different kind of work. "I had access to you. I knew you. I could have asked questions that the evidence alone wasn't asking. I didn't, because I believed that the integrity of the investigation required me to follow the evidence without letting personal knowledge contaminate the findings," Cross said. "Yes." He was quiet for 4 steps. "You weren't wrong about the principle." "I was wrong about the application," she said. "The principle exists to protect investigations from bias. Using it to avoid asking hard questions of someone I knew that wasn't integrity. That was distance dressed up as integrity." She looked at him. "I'm sorry, Daniel." He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice had the quality of something that has been held for a very long time and is being carefully, precisely released. "I know," he said. "I know you are." He paused. "I also know that you're the only person who could have gotten to me tonight. And I built that contingency on knowing it." That sentence carried everything. The forgiveness and the complication of forgiveness. The understanding that trust and damage can exist in the same space. The particular human math of relationships that have been broken and are being rebuilt in real time by people who are too busy surviving to do it properly. Lucas's voice cut through the comms. "Calder status." "Static." Then, 60 meters. Keep moving." "Copy. I'm ready when you are." More static. Wind in the signal. Then Okafor's voice lower. 30 seconds, Grant. Be ready." Audrey did not slow down. She did not look at her tablet. She moved forward, and she counted breaths, and she let the part of herself that was listening for Calder's voice exist, alongside the part that was leading 22 people across 400 meters of hostile terrain in a deteriorating storm, because that was what the moment required. And she had learned at the highest possible cost, that the only response to what the moment requires is to meet it. The shelter appeared through the storm as a shape that the wind was treating differently than the surrounding terrain, a solidity, a resistance, and then resolved into the structure itself as they got close enough. It was smaller than it would have looked on a survey map, which is what pre-digital survey maps do. They suggest space that the physical reality doesn't always deliver. But it was there, it was intact, and the door opened when Audrey worked the manual release, with hands that had been cold for long enough that she had to think about the mechanics of gripping consciously rather than relying on reflex. Inside, everyone moved. Cross set the module in the most protected corner of the space, his back to the wall, his eyes on the door. The operators organized the survivors with blankets from their packs, the emergency thermal type that fold into nothing and unfold into the difference between a survivable temperature and one that isn't. Hannah sat beside Cross and opened her evidence bag and simply held it, not checking the contents, not reviewing anything, just holding it with the physicality of someone who has been carrying something important for a long time and needs to feel it in their hands to believe it's real. Kowalski sat down for the first time since the maintenance chamber, and then with the silent collapse of a person whose rigidity has reached its limit at exactly the right moment. She pressed her face into her hands and allowed herself to cry briefly quietly without asking anyone's permission or assistance, and then she straightened up and said, "What do we do now?" "We wait for Calder," Audrey said. "And we trust Lucas." The comms crackled. "Mark," Calder said. Lucas activated the jam. The next 30 seconds were the longest 30 seconds that Audrey Mercer had experienced since the night 4 people died on a polar rescue while she sat in a command tent in the dark and listened to a weather system she had predicted do exactly what she said it would do. She did not close her eyes. She did not hold her breath. She stood in the shelter doorway, half inside, half out, and she let the storm hit her face, and she counted. A sound from upslope, not the controlled percussion of a demolition charge. Not the catastrophic structural release of an avalanche, but a different sound. Shorter, sharper. The sound of a physical confrontation resolving. Then Calder's voice on comms. "Trigger source secure. 2 contractors detained, 4 retreating downslope. We're coming in." The shelter exhaled. Lucas made a sound that was not quite a word, but contained approximately the emotional weight of 3 or 4 of them. He set his panel down with the careful deliberateness of someone whose hands are slightly unreliable from adrenaline and does not want to damage the equipment. Okafor came through the door first, supporting a contractor whose hands were secured and whose expression was the particular blankness of a man who has had his plan comprehensively end and hasn't yet decided what to do with that information. Calder came through after, with a second secured contractor, and the detonation trigger, a commercial-grade remote device. Nothing military exactly as Lucas had read it in his gloved hand. He looked at Audrey across the crowded shelter. She looked back at him. He said, "Grant was right on the encryption." "I know," she said. "And you were right about the exit." He paused. "And the shelter." "I know that too," she said. He almost smiled. It was extremely brief, and it disappeared immediately, but it had been there, and several people in the shelter had seen it. And Lucas in particular noted it with the same quiet attention he had been giving everything in this operation, filing it alongside everything else he was going to spend a long time thinking about. Calder crossed to where Audrey was standing. He dropped his voice. "The 4 who retreated are going for backup, or they're going for a manual contingency on those charges. We have maybe 30 minutes before." He checked his watch. 14 hours, minimum. 11, Audrey said. "My model had the storm breaking at hour 11, not 14. The pressure system is moving faster than the extended forecast predicted, which is consistent with the pass closing early." Calder stared at her. "You're telling me the storm breaking faster is good news?" "I'm telling you that the storm breaking at hour 11 instead of hour 14 means our extraction window opens 3 hours earlier than the official forecast suggested," she said. "Which matters because the 4 contractors who just retreated are going to reach their staging area in approximately 90 minutes. Whatever they come back with, we want extraction aircraft in the air before they get back." Hai took that in. "You contacted command. The moment we entered the shelter, Wolfe has aircraft on standby." She looked at him steadily. "I've been running this calculation since we left the vent shaft. I didn't tell you because you had your own calculation to run, and you didn't need mine in your ear while you were running it." He looked at her for a long moment. And in his face, in the lines of it, in the particular way that a man's face settles, when the version of reality he has been holding starts to align with the version in front of him. Something shifted. Not dramatically. Not with any of the theater that the moment might in a different story have been given. Just a quiet internal adjustment. The sound of a wall not coming down, but developing finally a door. "Commander," he said, and the word came out differently than it had the first time Wolfe said it in the hangar. That time from Calder's mouth, it had been the word of a man grudgingly acknowledging a chain of command. This time it was something else, the word of a man acknowledging a person. "What do you need from me?" "Your team's medical assessment on the survivors," she said immediately. "Priority on Kowalski. She's been in a sealed space the longest, and she's running on empty. I need to know if anyone has cold injury progression, and I need to know in the next 10 minutes. She paused. "And I need you to sit down and eat something because you've been running at redline since the hangar, and I need you functional for extraction." He blinked. It was the first time in the entire operation that he had been surprised by something she said. "I need all of you functional," she said, before he could interpret the previous statement incorrectly. "That includes me. I'm eating too." The corner of his mouth moved. He turned and started giving quiet instructions to his team, and Audrey sat down on the shelter's bench, pulled a ration pack from her gear, and ate with the methodical efficiency of someone who knows that nutrition is an operational requirement and not a preference, while across the shelter. Daniel Cross watched her with the expression of a man seeing something he has known for years, finally being seen by the people who needed to see it. Hannah sat down beside Audrey. She had been waiting for this moment, not intrusively, but with the patient timing of an intelligence officer who knows when information is most useful. "The network administrator," Hannah said. "The one Cross identified as being on Arcturus's payroll." Audrey looked at her. "What about him?" "He's not at this station," Hannah said. "He was transferred 3 months ago. He's currently working at the Joint Command Communications Hub in Anchorage." The shelter went quiet because the people who understood what that meant understood it immediately, and the people who didn't could read it in the faces of those who did. "He has access to everything," Lucas said. He had been listening, which Audrey had come to understand was his baseline state. Always listening, always processing, always 3 seconds ahead of when he was going to need the information. Every communication between this station and Joint Command, every rescue coordination message, every extraction request. "He's been watching this operation since it launched," Hannah said. "Which means Arcturus knows exactly what we recovered and exactly what we're trying to do with it." Cross spoke from his corner. "They also know there's an evidence drive in addition to the module." His voice was very calm. "They'll want both." Calder was on his feet again. Not frantic, the opposite of frantic, in the way that genuine urgency sometimes produces in people who are trained to respond to it, but very alert. "If the administrator is monitoring communications, our extraction coordination is visible," Audrey said. She was already on her tablet pulling up the command frequency. "Which means we need to get word to Wolfe through a channel the administrator isn't watching." "What channel is he not watching?" Calder asked. Audrey looked at Lucas. Lucas looked at his equipment, and then he looked at the module sitting in the corner with Cross's hands resting on it. The module with its passive resonance function, its built-in rescue beacon, the one that Audrey had designed into the casing for exactly the situation where standard communication was compromised. "The module's pulse," Lucas said. "Can you encode a message in it?" Audrey asked. "It's not designed for—" He stopped. He tilted his head slightly, running the technical problem the way she'd watched him run every technical problem, not around the edges of it, but directly into the center, looking for the place where the constraint became a feature. "The pulse has a variable interval. If I modify the interval pattern, it's not Morse, it's not a standard encoding, but if I build a pattern key with what we have—" "A one-time pad," Cross said. He was on his feet moving toward Lucas. "We used a one-time pad protocol in the original station design for exactly this scenario. An encoding system that only Audrey and I know." Audrey and Cross looked at each other across the shelter. Two people who have built something together who have been separated by damage and time and the complicated machinery of institutional failure, and who are now in a shelter on a mountain in a storm, being asked to use the thing they built together to finish something that matters. "Tell me the key," Lucas said. Cross sat beside him. He began speaking in a low voice, and Lucas began building, and the module in the corner began its quiet, patient pulse, a heartbeat in the rock reaching upward through the storm toward a sky that was too thick for aircraft, but not too thick for a signal that knew exactly where it was going. Audrey watched them work. Calder appeared beside her. "Wolfe will understand the encoding," he asked. "How was present when the one-time pad protocol was established," Audrey said. "He'll know what it means when the pulse pattern changes. And the administrator won't be able to read it. Commercial monitoring systems aren't built to detect passive resonance signals from module casings," Audrey said. "They scan active communication frequencies. It's underneath the noise floor of every system he's watching." She paused. Cross built the station's monitoring architecture. He knew exactly what it could and couldn't see. Calder was quiet for a moment. Then, "He built you a blind spot." "He built the station a blind spot," Audrey said. "And tonight we're standing in it. The message went out at 19 minutes past the hour. 40 seconds of variable interval pulse encoding 14 words in a system that existed in the minds of two people and a set of design documents that had been classified for 15 years. Then they waited. Calder's team had completed their medical assessment of the survivors and reported to Audrey with the quiet precision she had come to expect from them. She had noticed in the hours since the hangar that Calder's unit communicated with her differently when he wasn't actively questioning her authority. They were professional. They were thorough. They gave her exactly what she needed without requiring her to perform her rank for them. She understood that this was what Calder's actual leadership looked like when it wasn't occupied with resistance, and she understood that this was a team she would want beside her under any circumstances, if the man leading them could find his way to the same place she was trying to lead him. She was beginning to believe he could. Kowalski was stable, but needed warmth and monitoring. Two of the other survivors had early-stage cold stress, but nothing requiring intervention beyond what the team was already providing. The fourth and fifth survivors were, as Okafor put it, with the particular economy of a man who doesn't dress things up, tough people who've had a rough 36 hours and could use a hot meal and a bed, but are not currently in danger. Hannah was reviewing the evidence drive for the fourth time, not because she didn't know what was on it, but because intelligence officers in her position review everything multiple times on the theory that something you missed on the third read might appear on the fourth. Cross sat beside her, answering her occasional quiet questions with the patience of a man who has rehearsed this testimony in his mind for 2 years and is now simply waiting to deliver it to the right people. The shelter was considering everything remarkably functional. It was Calder who noticed the change in the storm first. He had been standing near the shelter's small port window, not a real window, just a structural gap that had been fitted with a transparent panel during the original construction, watching the weather with the focused attention of someone who has learned to read it as a tactical environment. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "It's shifting." Audrey looked up. "The wind," he said. "It was running northeast. It's moving more east now. The pressure is—" He paused. "The pressure is dropping differently than before." She crossed to him and looked at her tablet, and looked at what the atmospheric sensors were telling her, and felt something that she would not have allowed herself to call relief. Because relief before an extraction is premature, and she knew it, but it was something in that register, the specific sensation of a calculation that has been holding at the edge of its margin, beginning to move in the right direction. "Hour 9, she said. "Not 11. The system is breaking faster than even my accelerated model suggested." Calder looked at her. "You said 11. "My models have margins," she said. "This is outside the margin, in our favor." She was already pulling up the command frequency, not their primary channel, which the administrator could see, but a secondary frequency that was going to look like sensor noise to anything monitoring the system but would reach Wolfe's aircraft. "We have a window opening. It's small, and it's going to be rough, and extraction is going to be nothing close to comfortable." "My team doesn't need comfortable," Calder said. "I know," she said. And for the first time since the hangar, there was something in her voice that was not purely operational. Something that acknowledged what had happened between them. Not the argument, not the hostility, but the understanding that had grown in the tunnel, and the shaft and the shelter. The incremental and painful and real understanding of two people who had both been right and both been wrong, and had found out that these things can coexist in the same person without making them a contradiction. "I'm going to get everyone off this mountain." He looked at her. "I know you are." And then the comms came alive with General Wolfe's voice, not through the primary channel, not through anything the administrator was watching, but through the secondary frequency. Audrey had opened encoding a response to the module's one-time pad message in plain language that the administrator would never hear, because the administrator did not know this frequency existed. "Northern Lantern Team, this is Wolfe. Message received and understood. 2 aircraft inbound. ETA 14 minutes. Extraction coordinates received. Be advised, federal warrant has been issued for the Anchorage Communications Administrator. Joint Command is now operating on isolated channels. You are clear. Come home." The shelter was quiet for 3 seconds. Then, Lucas Grant, 27 years old, the least experienced person in the room, the one everyone had been treating like a liability until 37 minutes ago, when he cracked a military-grade encryption in a tunnel while the mountain tried to come down on top of him. Lucas Grant pressed both hands flat on his equipment panel and closed his eyes and breathed. No one commented on it. Several people understood it. Calder moved to the shelter door and began coordinating the extraction sequence, his voice falling into the clean, rapid efficiency of a man in his element, the man he was when he was not occupied with resistance. And Audrey watched him work and understood that this was the same person she had seen in the hangar, and also a different person, and that both things were true. Simultaneously, the way most important truths about human beings are simultaneously contradictory and complete. Cross touched her arm. She turned. He was holding the module. He held it out to her. "You should carry it out," he said. She looked at it. "You brought it this far." "You built it," he said. "And everything that comes next, the investigation, the testimony, the people who are going to want to understand how Arcturus built this conspiracy, it starts with you walking out of this shelter with that module in your hands." He paused. "That's not charity. That's just accurate." She took the module. It was heavier than it looked, the way things that matter always are. "Daniel," she said. "I know," he said again. And again it contained everything. Outside, through the cleared section of storm that was still rough and still cold and still required everything they had to move through, but was no longer the absolute wall it had been 40 minutes ago. The sound of rotors reached them, distant, determined, getting closer. Audrey stepped out of the shelter and into the mountain air and looked up at the sky that was breaking open above her. And she thought about James, the way she always did in moments like this. Not with grief, not with guilt, but with the particular love that survives a person, that becomes a part of the way you do every difficult thing afterward. She thought, "I brought them home." Then Calder was beside her, directing his team into extraction formation, and the aircraft broke through the cloud cover, and the wind was still brutal, and the mountain was still trying to be a mountain, and Audrey Mercer held the encryption module against her chest and walked forward into all of it. The aircraft hit turbulence 3 times on the descent from the mountain, the kind that makes your stomach understand exactly how far above the ground you are, and nobody on either helicopter made a sound about it. They sat with the module and the evidence drive and the 5 survivors, and the 2 secured contractors, and everything they had carried out of that mountain, and they held on to whatever was bolted down, and they let the aircraft do what aircraft do, in the hands of pilots who know what they're doing. Audrey sat with the module in her lap the entire flight. Not because she had been told to, not because protocol required it, because Cross had handed it to her with a specific intention, and she understood what that intention meant for what came next. And she was not going to set it down until she could set it down in front of the people who needed to see it in her hands. Calder sat across from her. He had not slept, none of them had, but his eyes were alert in the way that certain people's eyes remain alert, past the point where alertness should be physiologically possible, running on something that is not caffeine and not adrenaline, but the particular sustained energy of a person who has not yet finished what they started. He watched her hold the module. He did not say anything about it. Lucas sat beside his equipment, which he had not fully powered down, even on the aircraft, running a post-operation diagnostic with the focused thoroughness of someone who needs to do something useful with his hands, while the rest of him processes what has just happened. He had the specific silence of a young person who has discovered something about themselves during the previous several hours and is not quite ready to look at it directly. Hannah had fallen asleep sitting upright, her hand still on her jacket pocket where the evidence drive was. Cross was awake beside her, watching nothing, thinking everything. His face doing the particular work that a person's face does when they are examining a long stretch of time and trying to understand what to do with the parts that cannot be recovered. Kowalski was asleep across 2 seats held in place by an operator's hand on her shoulder, not restraining her. Simply present the way you keep contact with someone who has been through something hard enough that you want them to feel a human hand without waking them to explain it. Naval Air Station. Kodiak came up through the cloud cover, and the aircraft touched down with the particular impact of a landing in conditions that have not fully cooperated. And then the doors were open, and the cold was back, and General Wolfe was standing on the tarmac with 3 other officers, and the kind of stillness that senior commanders develop. The stillness of someone who has been waiting and who has spent the waiting time deciding exactly what to do with the first moment after the waiting ends. He looked at Audrey first. She walked to him with the module and held it out and said, "Intact, unaccessed. Chain of custody documented from the moment Cross removed it from the primary server." Wolfe took the module with both hands. Not the gesture of a commanding officer accepting returned equipment, but something more deliberate than that, more personal, as if the weight of what it represented had to be received with both hands or not at all. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at Audrey. "Everyone?" he asked. "Everyone," she said. "All 6 station personnel, all 24 team members." She paused. 2 contractors secured, 4 retreated downslope. You'll want people at the Arcturus staging area within the hour. "Already moving," Wolfe said. He handed the module to the officer beside him and looked at Cross, who had come down from the aircraft behind Audrey and was standing with the particular stillness of a man who has practiced composure in difficult moments and is now in possibly the most difficult moment of all, the moment after survival, when you have to figure out what you're surviving into. "Daniel." Cross met the general's eyes. "Sir, you did well," Wolfe said. It was simple. It did not attempt to repair anything or compensate for anything. It was just accurate, said by a man who knew what accurate cost and chose to say it anyway. Cross's face moved in a way that he controlled immediately, but not fast enough that no one saw it. He nodded once and did not try to speak for a moment. Calder came down last. He walked past his team, pausing for 1 second with each operator, the particular communication of a commanding officer who knows his people and knows what they need without asking. And then he walked to General Wolfe, came to attention and said, "Sir, I need to report a conduct issue." Wolfe looked at him. "I challenged Commander Mercer's authority in front of the full team in the hangar before departure," Calder said. His voice was level. There was no performance in it, no theater of contrition. Just the flat, clean delivery of a man making an accurate account of something he had done. "I did it publicly, and I did it in a way that was designed to undermine her position before the mission began. I accept responsibility for that, and I accept whatever consequences the review determines are appropriate." The tarmac was quiet, except for the wind off the water, which at Kodiak was always present and always cold, and had no interest in the human dramas occurring in its vicinity. Wolfe looked at Audrey. She had not moved. Her expression was not satisfied. It was not forgiving. It was the expression of someone who has heard something accurate and is deciding what to do with it, and that decision Wolfe understood was hers to make. "I'll include it in my after-action report," Audrey said, "along with my assessment of Senior Chief Calder's performance during the operation." She paused. "Both of which are relevant to any conduct review." Calder looked at her. He held her gaze and waited, because the thing she had just said could mean several different things, and he was not going to assume he knew which one she meant. "Let's get everyone inside," Audrey said. "We have a lot to debrief, and I need dry socks." It wasn't a joke exactly, but several people laughed, the specific, slightly too intense laughter of people who have been in extremity for hours and need to release something, and then everyone was moving toward the building, and the tarmac was clearing, and the aircraft were being secured, and the operation that had begun 14 hours ago with a red marker on a mission map was transitioning into everything that comes after. The debriefs took 6 hours. There were 4 of them running simultaneously, Audrey with Wolfe and the Joint Command Oversight Team, Calder with the Operational Review Board, Cross and Hannah with the federal investigators who had been flown in from Anchorage on 2 hours' notice, and Lucas separately with the Technical Analysis Team who had questions about the encryption blocking procedure that became a conversation lasting 4 hours. Because what Lucas had done in that tunnel was, technically speaking, not supposed to be possible with the equipment he had available, and the Technical Analysis Team wanted to understand every step of how he had done it. Lucas answered every question with the careful precision of someone who is aware that what he did was improvised and who wants to be honest about the difference between the procedure he used and the procedure that was designed. He also, at the end of the 4th hour, when the lead analyst asked him what he would do differently, said nothing. And then after a pause, "Actually, I would have started the jam half a second earlier. I was running the verification 1 extra time when I already had the answer. I was being cautious when I should have trusted the read." The lead analyst made a note. Then she said, "Petty Officer Grant, how old are you?" 27, he said. She made another note. The federal investigation into Arcturus Defense Solutions moved faster than most federal investigations, which is the particular velocity that classified operations achieve when the evidence is comprehensive. The documentation is clean, and the officials managing the case have a strong personal interest in resolving it quickly before it becomes public in ways they cannot control. Cross's 2 weeks of surveillance records were complete. Hannah's 48 hours of field documentation were meticulous. The network administrator in Anchorage was in federal custody within 6 hours of the aircraft landing at Kodiak, which meant before he could delete anything or contact anyone at Arcturus who might have been able to accelerate their own document destruction. The module's access log confirmed exactly what Cross had said. Unaccessed since removal chain of custody, intact timestamp verification, matching his account to the minute. The federal prosecutors who reviewed it used the word airtight twice in the first hour, which is not a word federal prosecutors use lightly. 3 Arcturus executives were arrested within 48 hours. 2 compromised defense officials followed within a week. The investigation expanded laterally in the way that investigations into institutional corruption expand when the initial evidence is strong enough, touching adjacent contracts, adjacent officials, adjacent decisions that had been made over years with the quiet understanding that certain questions would not be asked. Daniel Cross was officially cleared. Not for the second time, the first clearing had been the review panel's finding that he had not intentionally caused the original breach. This was something different. This was a formal federal determination that Cross had not only been innocent of the original accusation, but had 2 years later at personal risk, and without institutional support, identified and documented a conspiracy that the institutions themselves had failed to detect. Audrey read the formal determination in her office at Kodiak 3 days after the operation. She read it twice. Then she sat with it for a while, not reviewing it, not analyzing it, just sitting with the specific weight of a document that means that something which should have been said sooner has finally been said, and the fact of its lateness does not disappear simply because the statement has arrived. She called Cross. He answered on the second ring. He was in Anchorage meeting with the federal legal team living in a temporary apartment that the oversight office had arranged. His voice sounded, she thought, like a man who was sleeping for the first time in a long time. Not rested yet, not anywhere close to rested, but in the process of beginning to be rested, which is a different thing, and in its own way, more fragile. "I read the determination," she said. "I know," he said. "They told me you were sent a copy." "Daniel, I want to say something that I should have said 7 years ago when we were still building that station. When I still had the daily access to you, that would have made this a conversation instead of a phone call." "Audrey, let me say it," she said, not harshly, firmly. "You taught me how to think about security architecture. You taught me that a system's weakest point is always the assumption you didn't examine. And then I built an investigation that was based on an assumption I didn't examine. The assumption that the evidence I had was the evidence that existed." She paused. "I examined everything except you. And I should have examined you, which in this case means I should have asked you directly what happened. Not because I owed you a pass, but because you deserve to be part of the investigation into your own name." Cross was quiet for a moment. "You know what I've thought about these past 2 years, not the clearance hearings, not the termination. What I've thought about is the design review for the research tunnel. You argued with me for 3 days about the access plate mechanism. You said the standard release catch was wrong, that anyone with enough time and the right tools could work it from the outside, and that was a security gap we hadn't accounted for." "I remember," Audrey said. "I told you the standard mechanism was within spec. You said being within spec and being right were not always the same thing." He paused. "You were right. You changed the mechanism, and it's why the contractors couldn't seal that tunnel from the outside when they locked down the station." He let that sit for a moment. "You've always known the difference between what the system says and what's true. I don't know why you forgot it when you were looking at me." It was the most honest thing anyone had said to her in years. Not cruel. Cross was not capable of cruelty toward her. She understood even now, even after everything. But precise. The kind of precision that only comes from someone who has thought about a thing for long enough to get all the way to the center of it. "Because I trusted the evidence more than I trusted my own read," she said. "And I trusted my own read less than I should have because I was afraid of being accused of bias, of being the woman who protected the man who protected her." She let that out slowly. "I overcorrected. I went so far in the direction of objectivity that I left you on the other side of it." "Yes," Cross said. "That's right." He paused. "I forgave you for that a long time ago. I want you to know that. Not because it doesn't matter, it matters. But because I know you, and I know that you have been carrying it, and I want you to be able to put it down now." Another pause. "The institutional process failed both of us. You did what you knew how to do with the evidence you had. What I needed wasn't a perfect investigator. What I needed was a system that was built to ask the right questions. That's what you're building now." Audrey did not speak for a moment. She looked at the determination document on her desk and thought about the station on the mountain, about the access plate mechanism and the research tunnel and the passive resonance beacon and all the things she had built in against the failure modes she had identified, and about all the failure modes she had not identified, and about the fact that the difference between a system that works and a system that fails is almost always the question you didn't know to ask yet. "Come back to work," she said. Cross said nothing for a moment. "Audrey, not here, not in the field. I'm building an Arctic Operations Program Joint Command structure integrated from the planning stage. Every specialist involved before the mission brief, not brought in after the plan is already set." She paused. "I need someone who can design the security architecture for the new station network. Someone who understands the difference between within spec and right." She paused again. "And someone who will tell me when I'm examining everything except the thing I need to examine." The silence on the line was long. It had layers to it: the 2 years, the clearance hearings, the temporary apartment in Anchorage, the phone call from Wolfe on the tarmac, the federal determination that had arrived 3 days ago, and underneath all of it somewhere, the design review for the research tunnel, and the 3 days of argument about an access plate mechanism and the version of themselves that had existed before all of this happened. "Send me the program documentation," Cross said finally. "Already did," she said. 30 minutes ago." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. It had the quality of something that wanted to be a laugh and was becoming one incrementally. "Of course you did." She almost smiled. "Read it tonight. Call me tomorrow." She ended the call and sat with the determination document for another minute. Then she opened a new file on her computer and began writing a recommendation, not for Cross's formal reinstatement, which was already being processed through the appropriate channels, but for his specific role in the new program, which required the kind of precise language that official reinstatement documents don't use, but that will be read by the people who decide how much authority a recommendation actually carries. She was halfway through the second paragraph when there was a knock on her office door. Calder. He had been at Kodiak for 3 days, not on operational assignment, technically on administrative hold, pending the conduct review, and she had seen him twice briefly in hallways, in the way that you see people at a duty station when you are both busy and both aware that there is a conversation coming that has not happened yet. "Got a minute?" he said. "Yes," she said. He came in and sat across from her desk. He had the look of a man who has been thinking about something for 3 days and has decided what he wants to say about it. It was, Audrey thought, a version of the look she had seen on his face in the tunnel, the look of a man arriving somewhere after a long distance. "The conduct review is completed," he said. She already knew this. Wolfe had informed her an hour ago. And formal reprimand, on record, mandatory completion of a joint command integration course. He paused. "And a requirement that I complete what they're calling a specialist integration protocol before I can lead another joint operation." "That's appropriate," Audrey said. "Yes," he agreed. "No resistance in it, no qualification, just agreement. I also want to say something that's not part of the formal process." "Go ahead." He looked at her directly. Calder was not a man who looked away from things he had decided to face, which was, she had come to understand, both one of his greatest strengths and the source of most of his significant errors, because the things he decided to face depended entirely on the accuracy of his prior assessment of what was in front of him. "I made a decision about you in the first 2 seconds," he said. "Before you said a word, before you put that marker on the map. I looked at you, and I ran you through a filter that was based on what I had lost and what I had decided to do with that loss, and I put you in the wrong category." He paused. "I've been running that filter for 3 years, since Brennan. I told myself it was operational judgment. It wasn't. It was grief that I'd repackaged as principle." Audrey did not interrupt. "I've buried men," he said. "And the way I handled that, the way I decided to never again wait for approval from someone who wasn't on the ground, that is a decision I still believe in. What I got wrong was applying it to you." He looked at her. "You weren't asking me to wait. You weren't asking me to defer to someone who didn't know what they were doing. You were the person who knew what they were doing. And I couldn't see that because I'd already decided what I was looking at." "Yes," Audrey said. She kept it clean. He didn't need her to elaborate. "On the mountain," he said. "In the tunnel. When you told me about James." She held his gaze. She did not close herself against the name. "I've been thinking about what you said," he continued. "That we both learned opposite lessons from loss. That you fear reckless speed and I fear fatal hesitation." He paused. "I think we were both right. And I think we were both using being right as a reason not to examine the rest of it." "Yes," she said again. "So I want to ask you something." He stopped. He was reaching for something careful, and she could see the care in it, the specific effort of a man who does not usually reach for careful things and is doing it anyway because he has decided it matters. "The program you're building. Wolfe told me about it." "Wolfe tells you things," she said. "He told me you're looking for tactical commanders who can work in integrated planning structures without defaulting to hierarchy as a substitute for analysis." A pause. "He also told me you'd already identified 3 candidates. He didn't tell me if I was one of them." Audrey looked at him. The man sitting across her desk was the same man who had said, "Lost sweetheart," across a hangar, the way you throw a weight to find out if the floor holds. He was also the man who had said, "Understood, Commander," in a tunnel with the detonation trigger armed and the clock running. Both of those men were real. The question was not which one was true. The question was which one he was building himself toward. "You're one of them," she said, conditionally. He waited. "The condition is this," she said. "The program requires the tactical commander to complete the joint planning process from the beginning. Not review a plan that's already been built, but sit at the table when the intelligence officers and the weather specialists and the communications personnel are still assembling the picture, before the mission shape has been decided." She held his gaze. "That means there will be moments when you know the tactical answer before the rest of the table does, and you will have to wait while they catch up." He didn't look away. "How long?" "Long enough that it feels like hesitation," she said. "Not long enough that it becomes one." He was quiet for a moment. "How do you know the difference?" "You learn it," she said. "By being in the room, by watching people think, by understanding that the time between identifying an answer and having everyone understand why it's the answer is not wasted time. It's the time where the plan becomes something that everyone can execute instead of something that only one person understands." He sat with that. The expression on his face was not easy, and he did not try to make it look easy, which she respected more than she would have respected the performance of comfort. "I'll do it," he said. "I know," she said. He looked at her. A brief question crossed his face. Not doubt, just the natural human uncertainty of a moment that is ending and becoming something else, and then it resolved into something steadier. "You already had it in the documentation," he said. "My name." "You were the right person for it before you knew you were," she said. "I was waiting for you to catch up." He stood. He looked at her across the desk, across the operational map she had replaced with a program development document, across everything that had happened between the hangar and here. "Commander," he said. "Senior Chief," she answered. He nodded. Once the nod, that is not subordination and is not equality exactly, but is somewhere in that productive territory between them. The territory where two people with different strengths and different histories decide that the combination is worth more than either of them standing alone. Then he turned and left, and Audrey turned back to her recommendation document and found the second paragraph and continued writing. She wrote for 40 minutes without stopping. It was the kind of writing that happens when you have been thinking about something for long enough that the words are not the hard part anymore, when the work of figuring out what is true has been done in the living of it, and the writing is just the part where you put it in a form that other people can use. When she finished, she read it through once. Then she sent it. Lucas appeared in her doorway 20 minutes later. He knocked on the open door with the knuckle of his index finger. The knock of someone who is aware that he is not senior and is not entirely sure of his welcome and has decided to come anyway, which Audrey had begun to understand was Lucas Grant's defining characteristic. "Technical analysis team," he said. "They're putting the blocking procedure in the training curriculum." "I heard," she said. "They're calling it the Grant block." He looked pained in the specific way that people who are not used to having things named after them look when they find out something has been named after them. "They don't have to. You did it," she said. "It gets your name. That's how it works." He stood in the doorway for a moment. "I wanted to say something, if that's okay." "It's okay." He came in and stood not sitting, not quite ready to be that settled, and looked at a point slightly to the left of her, which was how he managed conversations that were more personal than technical. "I've been in operational environments before. 2 deployments, 4 joint exercises. I've been—" He stopped, started again. "People treat me like the communications guy, which is what I am. I understand that. But in those environments it usually means I'm the person who hands other people the thing they need and then steps back while they use it." Audrey looked at him without interrupting. "On this operation," he said, "you handed me problems. Not equipment problems. And you stayed while I worked them. And when I wasn't sure—" He paused. "When I was in the tunnel and the encryption wasn't breaking and I wasn't sure I had the right approach, you didn't tell me what to do. You just—" He searched for the word. "You were there, and that made the difference." He looked at her directly now. "I just wanted you to know that it made a difference." Audrey considered what she was going to say, and then said the thing that was true, rather than the thing that was professionally appropriate. "You made the difference, Lucas. I just made sure the space was large enough for you to make it in." He nodded. He was doing the thing where he was filing something for later, adding it to the picture he was building. She had noticed this about him, the way he assembled things, the way he trusted the accumulation of observed fact over the efficiency of quick assessment. It was, she thought, going to make him an extraordinary officer. "One more thing," he said. "Yes. The program documentation that General Wolfe sent around. The Arctic Operations Integration Program." He paused. "There's a communications specialist slot in the planning structure." "There is," she said. "Is that slot—" He stopped, reconsidered his phrasing. "Am I being considered for it?" Audrey looked at him for a moment. Then she pulled up the program document on her screen and turned the monitor so he could see it. The communications specialist slot. His name was already in it. Lucas Grant looked at the screen. He looked at his name. He looked at Audrey. "You put it in before the operation was over," he said. "I put it in before we left Kodiak," she said. "I read your file, Lucas. I knew what you were going to do before you knew the situation you were going to do it in." She paused. The mountain just confirmed it. He stood in her office for another moment, with his name on her screen and the specific expression of a young person who has just discovered that someone has been believing in them for longer than they knew and is processing the particular combination of gratitude and responsibility that comes with that discovery. "Thank you," he said. "Go sleep," she said. "You look like you haven't slept since the tunnel." "I haven't," he admitted. "Go," she said. "That's an order." He almost smiled, the same almost smile she had seen at the base of the shaft when she gave him the space to do the thing he needed to do, and then he was gone, and Audrey was alone in her office with the recommendation document and the program documentation and the determination from the federal investigation and the quiet of a duty station in the late hours when most people have finally stopped. She sat with it. All of it. The weight of the module she had carried down the mountain. The access plate mechanism she had argued about for 3 days. The marker on the map in the hangar. The name James which lived in her, the way important things live, not as a wound anymore, not as a weight, but as a presence that walked beside her, and occasionally in moments like this reminded her what she was doing all of it for. She thought the system didn't fail Daniel because one person reported inaccurate evidence. It failed because nobody built it to ask the question she hadn't known to ask. And the only way to fix that was to build something where the question gets asked before the crisis, not after. She opened a new section of the program document and began writing again. Outside the wind. Off the water was doing what the wind at Kodiak always does, running without interruption across everything, cold and present and entirely indifferent to the human stories playing out beneath it. And inside, Audrey Mercer wrote the next version of a better system, one that had been built on the failures of the previous one, the way everything worth building is. The federal indictments came down on a Tuesday morning, and by Wednesday afternoon, the story had enough momentum that the classified portions were already straining against the edges of what the Oversight Committee could keep sealed. 3 Arcturus executives, 2 defense officials. The network administrator from Anchorage, whose name Audrey had known for 72 hours before the arrest warrant was issued, and whose arrest she had watched play out on a secure feed in Wolfe's office, with the specific complicated feeling of someone who has spent a long time looking at a problem, and has finally seen it resolved without being able to take any simple satisfaction in the resolution, because the resolution was real. But Daniel Cross was still 46 years old, and still living in a temporary apartment in Anchorage, and still 2 years behind where his career should have been. The indictments were justice in the institutional sense. They were accurate, they were proportionate, they would result in consequences that matched the actions. But they could not give back the thing that had been taken, and Audrey understood in the way she understood most important things, that understanding this was not pessimism. It was precision. You cannot build a better system on a foundation of believing the previous one's failures were fully repairable. You build it on the honest accounting of what was lost and the decision to make different choices going forward. She said as much to Wolfe 3 days after the indictments, sitting in his office, with the final after-action report on the table between them. Wolfe read the relevant section twice. He did not push back on it. He did not reach for the institutional language that allows a senior commander to acknowledge failure without fully inhabiting it. He read it, and he sat with it, and then he said, "The program." "The program," Audrey agreed. "You need resources," he said. "I need authority," she said. "Resources follow authority. What I need is the formal mandate to build the planning structure from scratch, not reform the existing one, not introduce integration requirements into a system that will treat them as additions rather than foundations. Start from the beginning." Wolfe looked at her. He had the expression of a man who knows what he is being asked and knows what saying yes will cost in the currency of institutional resistance, which is the most expensive currency in military administration. "You know what the opposition looks like." "I know exactly what it looks like," she said. "Tactical commanders who believe integration slows response time. Intelligence officers who believe field operators don't have the context to evaluate their assessments. Specialists who have spent their careers being brought in after decisions are made and have learned to see that as the natural order." She paused. "And senior officers who have watched 2 versions of the same avoidable disaster and have decided the answer is better personnel rather than better architecture." "You're describing the majority of the command structure," Wolfe said. "Yes," she said, "which is why the mandate has to come from above the command structure's comfort level." He looked at her for a long moment. There was something in his expression that was not quite amusement, but was in its neighborhood, the look of a man who has been watching someone make an argument he already agrees with and is enjoying the quality of the argument, even though he knows where it is going. "I'll make the call," he said. "Today," she said. "This afternoon," he said. She stood. "Thank you, sir." "Audrey," he said. She turned. "The after-action section on Senior Chief Calder." He tapped the report. "You were thorough." "I was accurate," she said. "You were also generous," he said. "More than the conduct merited." She considered that. The conduct at the beginning of the operation didn't merit generosity. The conduct during and after it did. "I reported both." She paused. "I tried to be accurate about all of it. Wolfe nodded slowly. "That's the difference," he said more to himself than to her. "That's exactly the difference." She left his office and walked back toward her own, and halfway down the corridor, she passed Calder coming from the opposite direction. They had developed over the past week the particular navigation of two people who have been through something together and are still working out what that means for how they occupy shared space. Not awkward exactly, but deliberate. Aware of each other in the way that people are aware of significant things. He stopped. She stopped. "Wolfe's making the call," she said. He had known she was going to that meeting. He had not asked about the outcome because he had decided 3 days ago to stop being the person who asks about outcomes before they're ready to be shared. It was a small change, and it had cost him something, and he was aware of both. "The program gets the mandate," he said. "This afternoon," she said. He nodded. He started to move past her, then stopped again. "I've been working through the joint planning documentation you sent, the Phase 1 integration protocol. And there's a gap," he said. "In the tactical review sequence, the way it's currently structured, the communications specialist and the weather analyst present their assessments separately in sequence. The tactical commander reviews them in sequence." He paused. "But the actual decision point, the moment where those two inputs become a single operational picture, that's not built into the protocol. The expectation is that the tactical commander synthesizes them." Audrey looked at him. "That's the gap you found." "That's the gap," he said. "If the tactical commander is wrong about how to synthesize them, or if they're working from a prior assumption about what the picture should look like, the integration has already failed before the mission brief." She looked at him for a moment. He was right. She knew he was right the way she knew things that had been sitting at the edge of her awareness and had not yet been named, with the specific recognition of an answer to a question she had been forming without realizing she was forming it. "How would you fix it?" she said. He had thought about this. "A joint synthesis session, before the tactical commander reviews the individual assessments. The communications specialist and the weather analyst present to each other. First, they build the integrated picture together. The tactical commander comes in after." He paused. "The tactical commander's job isn't to synthesize. Their job is to respond to a picture that's already complete." "Which means they're responding to reality," Audrey said. "Not to their prior model of what reality should look like." "Yes," he said. She looked at him. This man who 3 weeks ago had said, "Lost sweetheart," across a hangar with 24 people watching, and who was now standing in a corridor at Naval Air Station Kodiak, explaining with precision and care, and a quality of thought that had clearly been building for days, how to fix the gap in her program architecture. "Put it in writing," she said. "Send it to me by end of day. I'm going to include it in the Phase 1 documentation." He blinked. "As a recommendation?" "As a design feature," she said, "with your name on it." She walked on, and he stood in the corridor for a moment, and the corridor was just a corridor. Institutional walls, fluorescent light, the constant ambient sound of a working duty station, and it contained something that had not been there 3 weeks ago, which was the beginning of a working relationship built on mutual respect that had been earned through the specific currency of shared extremity and honest reckoning. He went to write it down. The program's formal launch was 6 weeks after Operation Northern Lantern. Wolfe had moved faster than Audrey had projected, which she noted in the program's development log as a data point about what becomes possible when institutional resistance is addressed at the right level with the right mandate. The initial cohort was 12 officers from 6 specialties: Tactical Command, Intelligence Communications, Weather Analysis, Medical, and Arctic Operations. 4 of them had been on the Kodiak mission. The other 8 had been selected from across the Joint Command structure because their files indicated in various ways that they were the people who had been asking the right questions in the wrong rooms for long enough that the wrong rooms had started to feel like the only rooms available. Lucas Grant was the youngest by 4 years. He arrived for the first session with his equipment bag over one shoulder and a legal pad in his other hand, because he had not yet broken the habit of writing things by hand when he was trying to think clearly, and because he had learned on the mountain that thinking clearly was worth whatever tools it required. Cross arrived the day before the formal launch to complete the security architecture review for the program's classified planning system. He came through the main entrance at Kodiak with a temporary civilian contractor badge and the specific contained quality of a man who is returning to a world that asked him to leave and is measuring with every step how much of the old geography still matches the map he kept in his head. Audrey met him at the security desk. She did not make it formal. She simply walked out and stood beside him while he signed in and said, "The vent access on the planning system's server room is in the wrong place." He looked at her. "I know. I flagged it in the preliminary review." "I saw your flag," she said. "I'm telling you that I agree with it, and I've already authorized the change." He took his badge from the security officer and looked at it. Then he looked at her. "You didn't wait for me to argue for it." "I didn't need you to argue for it," she said. "I needed you to identify it. That's why you're here." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The temporary apartment in Anchorage had a view of the inlet. Very nice view. Very poor insulation." "You're being housed on base," she said. "Same building as the program staff." "I know. I read the arrangement letter." "Terrible view," she said. "But the insulation is adequate." Hai made the sound that was almost a laugh and was increasingly becoming one. "I'll manage." They walked through the security check together, and it was not easy, and it was not simple, and it did not pretend to be either of those things, and that was exactly right. The first training session began at 0800 on a Monday morning in January, 5 weeks after the operation, with wind off the water at Kodiak, doing its permanent indifferent work against everything outside, and 12 officers seated around a planning table that had been configured deliberately by Audrey's instruction as a circle. No head, no foot, no position that was architecturally more important than any other. Calder arrived 2 minutes before the session began. He had reviewed the Phase 1 documentation 4 times and had sent Audrey 6 additional notes, 2 of which she had incorporated, and 4 of which she had written detailed responses to, explaining why the existing approach was correct, which he had accepted without argument, because the explanations were accurate, and he had developed over the past 5 weeks the capacity to distinguish between disagreeing with an answer and being wrong about it. He took a seat at the circle. Lucas was across from him already with his legal pad open. Cross was in the room in an advisory capacity, seated against the wall to one side, present, but not at the table. A position that had been his suggestion, because he understood that the table needed to belong to the people who were building something new, and his role was to make sure the foundation was sound. Hannah Price was at the table. She had been assigned to the program's intelligence integration component. 3 days after the after-action report was finalized, which was fast by any standard, and which reflected the federal investigation team's conclusion that her fieldwork during the operation had demonstrated exactly the kind of integrated analytical judgment the program was designed to develop. There were 8 others around the circle, each of them carrying their own version of the question that had brought them here. Each of them, someone who had been in a room where the plan had failed because the wrong people were talking to each other in the wrong sequence, and who had decided that the way to answer that was to show up at 0800 on a January Monday at a duty station in Alaska and learn to do it differently. Audrey walked in at 0800 exactly. She looked at the circle. 12 people, 6 specialties. Everything that Operation Northern Lantern had demonstrated it was possible to build when the architecture was right. She said, "We're going to start with a question. Not a briefing. A question." She looked around the circle. "What did the last operation you were on get wrong in the planning phase, not the execution, the planning?" Silence for a moment. The silence of a room, recalibrating of people who have been trained to present solutions rather than name failures. Understanding that this room is going to work differently. Then a weather analyst named Petrakis, who had spent 3 years watching her assessments be incorporated into mission plans 2 days after the plans were already set, said, "They got my storm track data 48 hours after the route was decided. The route was wrong. The mission had to abort on day 2. "How many people knew your data was going to change the route?" Audrey asked. Petrakis looked at the table. "Me, my supervisor, possibly the operations officer, but by the time it reached him, the brief was already written and nobody wanted to rewrite it." "That's what we're here to fix," Audrey said. "Not the storm track, the 48 hours. The session ran 4 hours. It was not comfortable. Comfortable was not the goal. The goal was the thing that happens when people who have been operating in parallel tracks, each of them doing their job well, each of them solving their part of the problem without full knowledge of what the others were solving, are put in the same room and required to talk to each other before anyone writes anything down. At the end of the 4th hour, they had the outline of a mission planning sequence that was different from anything in the current Joint Command framework. Not dramatically different. Nothing that would require a restructuring of operational authority or a renegotiation of institutional hierarchy. Different in the specific way that changes the order of operations, which changes what information is available, which changes what decisions get made, and on what basis. Calder had contributed 4 times during the session. Each contribution had been tactical, clean, precise, drawn from experience. Each one had landed differently because the room it landed in had already been built by the intelligence officers and the communication specialists and the weather analyst, and so the tactical input was responding to a complete picture rather than constructing its own. He noticed the difference. He didn't say anything about it in the session, but at the end, when the room was clearing, he stayed at the table while others filed out, and he sat with what the 4 hours had felt like, which was not slower than what he was used to. Not the hesitation he had feared, but something else entirely. It felt like operating with better information. It felt like knowing the ground before you stepped on it, instead of learning the ground from the impact. Lucas appeared at his shoulder. "You're quiet," Lucas said. He had gotten less careful about pointing out things he observed over the past 5 weeks, having discovered that the people around him in this environment generally responded to observation with engagement rather than dismissal. "Thinking," Calder said. "About the protocol. About a mission I ran 2 years before Brennan," Calder said. "We had good tactical planning, good execution, clean extraction. By every standard measure, a successful operation." He paused. "We also had 3 civilians caught in the operation area who we hadn't known about because the intelligence assessment had been finalized before the communications specialist's last intercept was incorporated into the brief." He paused again. "The 3 civilians were fine. They were evacuated. Nothing went wrong." He looked at Lucas. "But I've thought about it for 2 years because nothing going wrong was luck, not design. And I've never had a name for what would have prevented the luck from being necessary." Lucas looked at him. "A joint synthesis session," he said, "before the tactical review." Calder looked at him. Then the corner of his mouth moved. "You saw the revision in the documentation." "I saw your name on it," Lucas said. "I read everything with someone's name on it." Calder stood. He looked at the circle of chairs, the configuration that had no head, no foot, no position more important than any other. He looked at it the way he looked at things he was learning, which was directly and without pretending the learning was easier than it was. "Grant," he said, "Senior Chief. You did well in the tunnel." Lucas absorbed this. Coming from Calder in this context, it carried a specific weight. "Thank you. I'm going to be harder on you in the program than I was in the field," Calder said. "Because in the field you were operating at the edge of your training, and the edge is where people find out what they're made of. In the program, you have time to build the foundation properly." He paused. "I'm going to make sure you build it properly." Lucas nodded. It was the nod of someone who understands that high expectations and investment are the same thing expressed differently, and who has decided to be grateful for both. They left the training room together, and the circle of chairs remained behind them. Empty now, waiting for the next session, patient, in the way that good structures are patient. 3 months into the program, the first thing broke. It was not a dramatic break. It did not involve a mountain or a storm or a compromised encryption module. It was a tactical commander in the 2nd cohort, a lieutenant commander named Reyes, decorated competent, with the particular confidence of someone who has been consistently right in high-pressure environments and has not yet had sufficient cause to examine the methodology behind the rightness, who sat through 4 sessions of the Joint Synthesis Protocol, and on the 5th session said at the table that he was not convinced the integrated approach was faster than the current system, and that speed was the primary variable in Arctic operations, and should be weighted accordingly. Audrey let him finish. Then she said, "What's the second variable?" Reyes looked at her. "Execution quality." "And the third?" A pause. personnel performance. And the fourth. He didn't answer immediately. She could see him trying to locate the fourth variable in the framework he had brought into the room with him, the framework built on the operations he had run and the lessons he had extracted, and finding that the framework had 3 legs, and he had never noticed. Information accuracy, she said. At the decision point. How accurate is the picture you're responding to when you make the call that the rest of the operation flows from? She looked at him. Speed matters. Execution matters. Personnel matter. But all 3 of those can be optimal, and the mission can still fail if the decision at the beginning was made on an incomplete picture. She paused. That's what this protocol is about. Not slowing the speed, improving the picture. Reyes sat with it. He was not a small-minded person. He would not have been selected for the program if he were, and she could see him actually working the argument rather than resisting it, which was the difference between someone who disagreed and someone who was learning. How do you prevent the synthesis session from becoming a consensus exercise, he said finally, where everyone agrees on the picture because agreement feels safer than conflict? Audrey looked at Cross, who was in his advisory position against the wall. Cross looked at Reyes. You build disagreement into the structure, Cross said. The communications specialist and the weather analyst don't present to each other to agree. They present to each other to find the gaps between their assessments. The gap is where the useful information is. He paused. Agreement means you've both been looking at the same data. Disagreement means one of you has something the other doesn't. Reyes looked at Cross. Then he looked at Audrey. That's not in the documentation. It is now, she said. She made a note on her tablet. Thank you, Lieutenant Commander. He blinked. He had come to the session expecting resistance. He had found integration. It was, she could see, a small recalibration, the kind that happens in increments, that doesn't announce itself, that shows up later in the way a person asks questions. Calder, sitting across the circle, caught her eye briefly. She gave nothing back except the steady acknowledgement of 2 people who have been in the same room long enough to communicate without performing. It was 4 months after the operation when the commendation for Lucas Grant was formally issued. Audrey had written it herself, which was not standard. Standard was to route it through the chain of command with a recommendation, but she had requested and received authorization to write it directly, and she had done so with the specific care she gave to documents that she wanted to exist exactly as she intended them to exist. It named him by name. It described what he had done in the tunnel in technical and operational terms that were accurate without being reductive. It noted the conditions, the equipment constraints, the time pressure, the signal attenuation through rock, and it stated plainly that the outcome of Operation Northern Lantern depended on his performance at that moment. She sent him a copy before it was filed. He read it in the program common room standing because he had been heading somewhere when she sent it, and had stopped mid-corridor when it came through and had stayed stopped for the duration. He came to her office afterward. He knocked. He came in. He stood across from her desk in the position she had come to associate with him when he was carrying something he was figuring out how to put down. You could have let the mission commendation cover it, he said. The collective one. I could have, she agreed. Why didn't you? She looked at him directly. Because 20 years from now, when you're making decisions that matter, I want there to be a document that exists in your record that describes exactly what you did at 27 in a tunnel in Alaska and names it correctly. She paused. Individual contributions disappear into collective citations. Individual citations follow people. I want this one to follow you. He stood there with the document on his phone screen, and the specific expression of a young person who has understood something not just about this moment, but about the category of moments it belongs to, about what it means to be seen accurately and to have that accuracy preserved. You do this for everyone, he said, don't you? This is why you insisted on naming the specific access route in Kowalski's medical report. Why you required Petrakis's storm track contribution to be logged separately in the after action. Every contribution that shaped the outcome needs to exist by name in the record, Audrey said. Otherwise, the record is a fiction, and we make our next decisions based on the record. She paused. Bad records make bad decisions. Lucas nodded slowly. He was going to think about that for a long time. She could see that he was going to think about it, and she was glad. 1 year after Operation Northern Lantern, Audrey and Calder returned to Kodiak for a joint exercise, not the same people they had been a year ago. Not entirely different people either, but people who had spent 12 months building something and watching it function, and finding the places where it needed to be adjusted, and adjusting them. Which is what the ongoing work of building better things looks like when you do it honestly. The exercise involved a new unit. Fresh operators. Fresh intelligence officers. Fresh specialists. People who knew the program from the documentation, but had not been present for what the documentation was built from. They gathered in the same hangar, the same overhead lights, the same cold draft from the doors, the same configuration of mission map and equipment racks, and the particular charged air of people who are about to do something difficult and know it. Audrey entered the hangar from the east door. She walked to the mission map. She set her pack down beside the equipment rack. She began reviewing the topographic overlay. From across the hangar, a new operator, young, experienced within his own frame of reference, carrying the particular confidence of someone who has been told he's exceptional and has not yet encountered the kind of moment that reveals what exceptional actually requires, said in a voice pitched to carry, "Who's the analyst?" He said it the way a certain kind of person says things that have a shape they believe is safely ambiguous. Not quite the words that could get him formally cited, just the weight of them. The hangar did not laugh, because Calder was standing at the front of the room. Calder had heard it. Every person in the room had heard it. Calder turned from the equipment and looked at the operator, not with anger, not with the theatrical force of a senior NCO, making a point through volume, but with the specific quiet attention of a man who has decided that this moment matters and is going to treat it accordingly. He said, "Come here." The operator came. He was realizing from the quality of the room's silence that he had miscalculated something, though he could not yet identify what. Calder looked at him. He looked at him the way he had learned to look at things he was assessing, not through the filter of prior assumption, not through the lens of what he expected to find, but directly at what was actually there. Then Calder said, "Lost sweetheart." The operator stared at him. "That's what I said," Calder continued. "The first time I saw Commander Mercer standing at a mission map, in this hangar." He did not look away from the operator. "I said it because I made a decision about her in 2 seconds based on what she looked like. I said it in front of 24 people because I had enough authority in that room to make it land." He paused. She had already correctly identified that our planned route would be impassable within 90 minutes. She had already identified a deception signal using a retired call sign that I had accepted as genuine. She already knew 3 classified access routes that weren't on my map. He paused again. And the first thing I said to her was, "Lost sweetheart." The hangar was completely still. "She didn't answer it," Calder said, "because it wasn't worth answering. She moved the marker and continued the briefing because she had a mission to run and 26 people to bring home, and she understood that my opinion of her was not her problem to solve." He looked at the operator. "I want you to think about what that says, about her, and about me." The operator said nothing. He was doing the recalibration that this story required people to do, the fast internal adjustment of finding out that the map you brought into the room does not match the territory. Calder stepped back. He turned toward the mission map, toward Audrey, who had not looked up from the topographic overlay during any of this, not because she was unaware, but because she was exactly who she had always been, doing exactly what she had always done, which was to focus on the mission and let everything else resolve itself through the quality of the work. "Commander Mercer," Calder said, and every person in the room heard the way her title sounded when it came from him. Not the sound of a chain of command being acknowledged, but the sound of a specific person being recognized by another specific person who has earned the right to make that recognition mean something. "Your team is ready." Audrey looked up from the map. She looked at the room, at the new operators, and the new specialists, and the new intelligence officers, at Lucas across the room, with his equipment bag and his legal pad at cross in the back corner, with the quiet watchfulness of a man who has returned to a world that tried to leave him behind, and has found against all probability that there is still work worth doing in it, at Hannah, beside the communications array, with the focused readiness of someone who has learned to trust the systems around her, because she helped build them at Calder, in front of them all, with the full measure of what a year of honest reckoning looks like on a person's face. She looked at all of it. She let it be exactly what it was: complicated, incomplete, continuing real. "Then let's bring everyone home," she said. And they did. Not because the mission was easy, it was not easy. Not because nothing went wrong, things went wrong, the way things always go wrong, the way any plan in contact with actual conditions encounters the gap between the map and the territory. But because when things went wrong, the people in the room knew how to talk to each other. They had the architecture, they had the language, they had the accumulated hard-won understanding that the person beside you who does not look like what you expected is almost certainly carrying something you need, and the only way to find out what it is to stop deciding what you're looking at before you've actually looked. That is what Audrey Mercer built. Not a protocol, not a program, not a commendation, or a curriculum, or a set of revised planning documents. Though she built all of those too. What she built was the conditions under which people could be seen accurately. Where a woman who designed a tunnel could be recognized as the person who designed the tunnel. Where a young communications specialist could crack an encryption in a rock shaft and have his name on the citation that followed. Where a man who had spent 2 years as a ghost in his own career could walk back through a security checkpoint with a badge that acknowledged what he actually was. Where a decorated SEAL team leader could stand in a hangar and tell the true story of his own mistake and make it the beginning of something better rather than the end of something lost. The world does not automatically make space for people who belong in it. Space has to be built. It has to be built deliberately on an accurate account of what failed and why, by people who are willing to do the slower, harder work of architecture instead of the faster, easier work of assignment. Rank can place you in command. Only honesty, accountability, and the daily choice to see clearly can make others choose to follow. And the leader who earns that following, who earns it not once in a crisis, but consistently in the ordinary hours, in the program sessions, and the documentation revisions, and the commendation letters that name individual people by name, that leader does not prove she belongs by being the strongest person in the room. She proves it by making the room strong enough to hold everyone in it. That was Audrey Mercer. That was what she built. That was what it cost her, and what it gave back, and what it continued to build long after she had moved the red marker and started the briefing and brought them all home. The story does not end in a hangar. It ends in every room where someone who was told they didn't belong stands at the mission map anyway, steady, clear-eyed, already working, and waits for the room to catch up to what they already know.